Chapter 1. The Assignment. The file was thin. Suspiciously thin, Kingsley Shacklebolt thought as he turned it over in his large hands, the manila folder barely thick enough to contain more than a few pieces of parchment. For a case involving magical disturbances around a registered magical child, it should have been considerably more substantial. He settled back into his chair at the ministry, the familiar creak of worn leather beneath him as he opened the folder under the warm light of his desk lamp. The atrium bustled with its usual mid-afternoon activity several floors below. But here in the aura department, the atmosphere held that particular quality of focused intensity that came with serious work. Around him, his colleagues bent over their own cases, dark wizard investigations, smuggling rings, the occasional rogue dragon incident. Routine work for the post-war period, when the ministry had settled into the business of rebuilding normalcy after the chaos of Voldemort's first rise and fall. This case, however, had been flagged as anything but routine. Potter, Harry James, Kingsley read aloud, his deep voice barely above a murmur. Date of birth, July 31st, 1980. Current address, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Guardian, Vernon and Petunia Dursley. The boy would be 9 in a few weeks then, old enough for his magic to manifest in more pronounced ways as he approached Hogwarts age, which would explain the recent uptick in reported disturbances. What troubled Kingsley was not the incidents themselves. Magical children frequently produced accidental magic, particularly when experiencing strong emotions, but rather what surrounded those incidents, or more accurately, what didn't surround them. He flipped through the sparse documentation. 3 reported instances of unexplained phenomena in the Little Whinging area over the past 2 months. A greenhouse full of flowers blooming out of season at the primary school. Several streetlights simultaneously shattering on Privet Drive during a summer evening, and a neighbour's complaint about their garden gnomes apparently rearranging themselves into military formations overnight. All within a reasonable radius of the Potter boys' residence. Standard protocol would have been to conduct a welfare check months ago. Standard protocol would have required regular monitoring of the child's well-being and magical development. Standard protocol would have generated a file thick with progress reports, medical evaluations, educational assessments, on and guardian interviews. This file contained none of those things. Instead, there was a single placement document dated November 1981, signed by Albus Dumbledore in his capacity as Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot. The authorization was unusually broad, granting Dumbledore discretionary authority over the child's placement and ongoing supervision. A handwritten note in the margin, in Dumbledore's distinctive slanted script, read, "Blood protection requires absolute privacy. No ministry interference necessary." Kingsley's brow furrowed as he reread the note. In his 15 years as an Auror, he had never encountered a case where ministry oversight of a magical child had been completely waived. Even children placed in witness protection retained regular, if discreet, monitoring. Or the Potter boy was not in witness protection. He was merely an orphan, placed with relatives. There should have been procedures. There should have been checks. There should have been someone asking whether the boy was safe. He pulled out a fresh piece of parchment and began making notes, his neat handwriting forming precise lines across the page. First, review all magical incident reports in the Little Whinging area for patterns suggesting distress rather than normal accidental magic. Second, research the Dursley family background, financial status, criminal history, previous involvement with magical persons. Third, conduct preliminary reconnaissance of the residence and household routine. And fourth, though he didn't write it down, find out why Albus Dumbledore had seen fit to place a magical child beyond the reach of ministry protection. The train journey to Surrey gave Kingsley time to think, the rhythmic clacking of wheels on track providing a meditative backdrop as London's urban sprawl gave way to suburban neighbourhoods and eventually to the determinedly ordinary landscape of Little Whinging. He had changed into Muggle clothing, a well-tailored navy suit, that made him look like any other professional travelling on business. The disguise was more than cosmetic. It was a reminder to himself to observe with muggle eyes, to see what a non-magical person might notice about the Potter household. Little Whinging proved to be exactly as mundane as its name suggested. Neat rows of identical houses lined pristine streets, to their small gardens maintained with mathematical precision. This was a place where conformity was valued above all else, where deviation from the norm would be noted and discussed at length over garden fences and coffee mornings. Privet Drive epitomized the area's commitment to aggressive normalcy. Number 4 stood out not for any remarkable features, but for its absolute adherence to suburban perfection. The lawn cut to regulation length, the driveway swept clean, the windows gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Even the car parked in the drive, a deep purple Vauxhall, seemed chosen for its aggressively conventional appearance. Kingsley positioned himself across the street, ostensibly waiting for a bus while actually studying the house and its inhabitants. He didn't have to wait long for activity. But the front door burst open at approximately 4:30, disgorging a boy of perhaps 8 or 9 years old, massive for his age, with the kind of bulk that spoke to unlimited access to sweets and second helpings. The child's hair was pale and sparse, his face round and flushed with the exertion of his explosive exit. Behind him lumbered an equally large man who could only be Vernon Dursley, his neck disappearing into the collar of a business suit that strained across his considerable girth. "Dudley, my boy!" Vernon's voice carried clearly across the street, booming with false joviality. "Ready for ice cream?" The boy, Dudley, responded with a whining complaint that Kingsley couldn't quite make out, but which involved a great deal of arm-waving, and what appeared to be demands for multiple flavours. So Vernon's laughter was the kind that suggested a man desperate to please a child he had never learned to discipline. They drove off in the purple car, Vernon still chuckling at something Dudley had said, leaving the house temporarily quiet. Kingsley waited. His patience was rewarded an hour later, when a thin woman emerged from the house. Petunia Dursley, he presumed, identifiable by her horse-like features and the nervous energy with which she moved. She spent several minutes fussing over the already perfect front garden, deadheading flowers that showed no sign of wilting and adjusting lawn ornaments that had not moved since his arrival. Her movements held a quality of anxious performance, as if she were very aware of being observed by her neighbours and was determined to present the correct image of domestic capability. Every so often, she glanced toward the front window of the house with an expression that Kingsley couldn't quite identify. Not affection, not even concern, but something closer to irritation mixed with wariness. As if something inside the house was behaving in a way that displeased her, but which she dared not address while in public view. The thought sent a chill down Kingsley's spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. Vernon and Dudley returned as the sun was setting, their arrival announced by Dudley's loud complaints about not being allowed to have ice cream for dinner. The family disappeared into the house, and lights began coming on in various windows as they settled into their evening routine. What struck Kingsley most forcefully was what he had not seen during 3 hours of observation. He had not seen Harry Potter. Not in the car with Vernon and Dudley, not in the garden with Petunia, not even silhouetted in a window as the family moved through their house, preparing for evening. In 3 hours of watching a household that supposedly contained a nearly 9-year-old boy, that boy had been utterly invisible. As Kingsley made his way back to the train station, his mind worked through the possible explanations. The boy could have been ill, resting in his room. He could have been at a friend's house, though that seemed unlikely given that Kingsley had seen no sign of neighbourhood children, including the Potter boy, in their activities. He could have been confined to his room as punishment for something, or he could have been deliberately hidden. The thin file seemed even more inadequate now, its sparse contents a glaring testament to 8 years of official indifference. As the train carried him back toward London, Kingsley found himself composing the report he would file the next morning, not the routine incident report his superiors expected, but a formal request for emergency authorization to conduct an immediate welfare inspection. Because something was very wrong at 4 Privet Drive, and Harry Potter's safety might depend on someone finally asking the questions that should have been asked years ago. The boy who had survived the killing curse deserved better than to disappear into a suburban prison while the wizarding world celebrated his victory and ignored his suffering. And Kingsley Shacklebolt, senior Auror and sworn protector of magical Britain, intended to make sure that better care began tomorrow, but even if it meant challenging the authority of the most powerful wizard in Britain to do it. Chapter 2. First contact. The morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made suburban secrets harder to hide. Kingsley had spent a restless night in a nearby inn, his mind cycling through procedures and protocols, while his instincts whispered that whatever he found at 4 Privet Drive would require him to abandon standard approaches in favor of something more fundamental. The protection of a child. He stood at the end of Privet Drive at precisely 9 o'clock, his appearance carefully calibrated to project authority without menace. The navy suit remained, but today he carried a slim leather portfolio that contained his ministry credentials alongside the sparse Potter file. His approach would be professional, courteous, and absolutely implacable. The walk to number 4 took less than a minute, but Kingsley found himself cataloguing details with the hyper-awareness that came before difficult conversations. The morning was quiet, except for the distant hum of a lawnmower and the occasional bark of a dog. Most of the residents had already departed for work or school, leaving the street with an empty, waiting quality. Vernon Dursley's purple car sat in the driveway, which meant the man was likely still home. Through the pristine front window, Kingsley caught a glimpse of movement. Someone large, crossing from one room to another, with the purposeful stride of a man preparing for his day. Kingsley pressed the doorbell and waited. The door opened with surprising speed, as if Vernon had been watching for visitors. The man who appeared in the doorway was even larger than he had seemed from across the street, tall and broad, with a thick neck that bulged over his collar and small, hostile eyes that immediately fixed on Kingsley with suspicion. "Good morning," Kingsley said, his voice carrying the calm authority of 15 years in law enforcement. "Mr. Vernon Dursley, I presume?" Vernon's face, already flushed from his morning routine, deepened to an alarming shade of purple. "If you're another one of those freaks—" "I'm Senior Auror Kingsley Shacklebolt," Kingsley interrupted smoothly, producing his credentials with practiced efficiency. The leather wallet fell open to reveal an official identification that, while incomprehensible to Muggle eyes, radiated an unmistakable aura of governmental authority. "I'm here to conduct a routine welfare check on Harry Potter, who is listed as residing at this address under your guardianship." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Vernon's face went through a rapid succession of colors, from purple to white to grey, while his mouth opened and closed without producing sound. Behind him, a thin woman with a long neck and sharp features appeared, her hands fluttering nervously at her apron. "There's no one here by that name," Vernon managed finally, his voice pitched higher than his bulk would suggest. "I think you've made a mistake." Kingsley's expression remained pleasantly neutral, though his dark eyes hardened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Dursley, ministry records clearly indicate that Harry James Potter, born July 31st, 1980, was placed in your care on November 1st, 1981. As his legal guardians, you are required to cooperate with official welfare inspections." "We don't want any trouble," Petunia Dursley said suddenly, her voice thin and sharp. She shot a warning glance at her husband, whose breathing had become audibly labored. "Vernon, perhaps we should—" "The boy is fine," Vernon snapped, though sweat had begun to bead on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. "Perfectly fine. No need for any inspections." "I'm pleased to hear that," Kingsley said, with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Then you won't mind if I see him briefly. Standard procedure requires visual confirmation of the child's well-being. It will only take a moment." Vernon's hands clenched at his sides. Now isn't a good time. He's ill. Sleeping. Contagious, actually. Wouldn't want you to catch anything. The lie was clumsy and desperate, confirming every suspicion that had been building in Kingsley's mind since he'd reviewed the inadequate file. He took a single step forward, not enough to be threatening, but sufficient to make it clear that he had no intention of being dismissed. "Mr. Dursley," he said, his voice dropping to the tone he reserved for suspects who had exhausted his patience, "I will see Harry Potter. Now, we can do this cooperatively, or I can return with additional personnel and a formal warrant. Your choice." The standoff lasted perhaps 10 seconds, Vernon's face cycling through rage, fear, and calculation, before settling on defeated resignation. "Fine," he spat. "But don't blame me when you see what a freak he is. Nothing but trouble since the day he arrived." Petunia made a small, distressed sound, but Vernon was already turning away, stomping through the house with the heavy tread of a man being forced into a corner. Kingsley followed, his trained eye automatically cataloguing the interior of the house. The Dursley home was aggressively normal in every detail: floral wallpaper, family photographs featuring a large blonde boy, furniture that spoke to middle-class prosperity without imagination. Everything was clean, ordered, and utterly conventional. It was also clearly designed around the comfort and preferences of 3 people, with no indication that a 4th person lived here. No indication except for the small door set beneath the staircase. Vernon stopped in front of it, his face now the color of old parchment. "Boy!" he shouted, his voice harsh enough to rattle the photographs on the hallway table. "Get out here! Someone wants to see you!" The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long. Then came the sound Kingsley would remember for the rest of his life, a small, careful scrabbling from behind the door, like a mouse emerging from its hole after checking for cats. The door opened slowly, revealing first a thin hand, then a narrow shoulder, and finally the face of Harry Potter. Kingsley's professional composure, carefully maintained through 15 years of investigating the worst that Wizarding Society could offer, cracked like glass. The boy was tiny, not just small for his age, but genuinely malnourished, his face gaunt, and his eyes too large in a skull that showed the clear lines of inadequate nutrition. His hair, black and perpetually messy, couldn't disguise the fact that his head seemed too heavy for his thin neck. The clothes he wore, a faded t-shirt that hung like a sack, and the trousers held up with what appeared to be rope, had clearly been designed for someone much larger and never adjusted to fit. But it was the boy's eyes that stopped Kingsley's breath entirely. They were bright green and startlingly beautiful, but they held an expression no 8-year-old should possess, a wariness so complete and automatic that it spoke to years of learning that safety was an illusion and kindness was a trap. Harry Potter looked at Kingsley with the eyes of a prisoner who had long ago stopped hoping for rescue. "Hello, Harry," Kingsley said softly, crouching down so that he was closer to the boy's eye level. The movement was careful, non-threatening, and the kind of approach he might use with a frightened animal. "My name is Kingsley. I'm here to make sure you're all right." The boy's reaction was immediate terror. He shrank back toward the cupboard door, his thin hands coming up as if to ward off a blow, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I haven't done anything wrong, sir. I've been good. I cleaned the kitchen, and I didn't eat anything I wasn't supposed to, and I didn't use anything strange happened because—" "Harry," Kingsley's voice cut through the desperate litany of self-protection with gentle firmness. "You're not in trouble. I'm not here to punish you. I just want to talk." Behind them, Vernon made a noise of disgust. "See? Unnatural. The whole lot of it. The boy brings nothing but trouble to decent people trying to live normal lives." Kingsley straightened slowly, his eyes never leaving Harry's face, but when he spoke, his words were directed at Vernon. His voice had gone very quiet and very cold. Mr. Dursley, I need you to step into the kitchen. Now. This is my house. Mr. Dursley. There was something in Kingsley's tone that brooked no argument, a quality that suggested Vernon was much closer to the edge of acceptable behavior than he realized. The kitchen. Now. Vernon retreated, muttering under his breath about freaks and ungrateful children, and the unfairness of decent people being harassed by government officials. Petunia followed him, shooting nervous glances over her shoulder. Kingsley turned his attention back to Harry, who was still pressed against the wall as if trying to disappear into it. The cupboard door stood open behind him, and Kingsley forced himself to look inside. What he saw made his hands clench into fists at his sides. The space was perhaps 4 feet wide and 6 feet deep, with a slanted ceiling that would require anyone taller than Harry to stoop. A thin mattress lay on the floor alongside a pillow that had clearly seen better days. A few ragged books were stacked in one corner next to what appeared to be a school uniform in desperate need of repair. The walls were bare, except for a small shelf that held a broken alarm clock and a spider web. This was where Harry Potter lived. This was where the boy who lived had spent the last 8 years of his life. "Harry," Kingsley said, his voice carefully controlled. "How long have you been living in there?" The boy's eyes darted toward the kitchen where Vernon's voice could be heard raised in complaint, then back to Kingsley's face. "Always, sir. Since I came here." "And when do you eat your meals?" "When there are leftovers, sir. And when I've been good." "When was the last time you saw a doctor?" Harry's brow furrowed in confusion. "A what, sir?" Kingsley closed his eyes briefly, feeling something dangerous and hot rising in his chest. When he opened them again, his expression had hardened into something that would have made his fellow Aurors step very carefully around him. "Harry," he said, "I need you to know that none of this is your fault. None of it. And I'm going to make sure that things change for you, starting today." The boy stared up at him with those too large, too wise eyes, and for the first time since the door had opened, something that might have been hope flickered across his thin features. "Really, sir?" "Really," Kingsley promised, and meant it with every fibre of his being. From the kitchen came the sound of Vernon's voice, growing increasingly agitated, punctuated by Petunia's nervous murmurs. But Kingsley no longer cared about managing the Dursleys' feelings or maintaining diplomatic relations with Harry's guardians. The time for diplomacy was over. The time for justice had begun. Chapter 3. Evidence and Protocol. Kingsley had investigated dark wizards who tortured for pleasure, smugglers who sold cursed objects to children, and criminals who perverted magic for unspeakable purposes. In 15 years as an Auror, he thought he had seen the depths of human cruelty. He had never encountered anything that made him feel quite as sick as watching Harry Potter flinch when offered a glass of water. "It's all right," Kingsley said quietly, keeping his voice level despite the fury building in his chest like a slow-burning fire. "You're thirsty, aren't you? When did you last have something to drink?" Harry's green eyes darted toward the kitchen, where Vernon's voice could still be heard complaining bitterly to Petunia, then back to Kingsley's face. The boy's hands shook slightly as he accepted the glass, and he drank with the desperate intensity of someone who had learned not to waste any opportunity for sustenance. "Thank you, sir," Harry whispered when he had drained half the glass, his voice hoarse in a way that suggested chronic dehydration. "I'm not usually allowed—" He stopped abruptly, his face going pale as he realized what he had almost admitted. Kingsley crouched down again, bringing himself to Harry's eye level while maintaining enough distance to avoid making the boy feel trapped. His mind was already working through the protocols he would need to follow, the evidence he would need to gather, the colleagues he would need to contact. But first, he needed to understand exactly what had been done to this child. "Harry," he said gently, "I need to ask you some questions. They might be difficult questions, but I need you to tell me the truth, all right? You're not going to get in trouble for anything you say to me." The boy nodded hesitantly, though his entire posture remained coiled for flight. "How often do you eat meals?" When there are leftovers, sir. And when I've been good and done all my chores properly." Harry's voice was barely above a whisper. "Sometimes Uncle Vernon says I don't deserve food when I've been freakish." Kingsley's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression carefully neutral. "And how long do you usually stay in the cupboard?" "All night, sir. And during the day when I'm not doing chores, or when company comes over, or when—" Harry's voice trailed off, and he glanced nervously toward the kitchen again. "When what, Harry?" "When something strange happens," Harry said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Like when Dudley's hair turned blue after he was mean to me, or when I ended up on the school roof when his gang was chasing me, or when the glass disappeared at the zoo and the snake got out. Uncle Vernon says I do it on purpose to cause trouble. But I don't, sir. I promise I don't mean to—" "Harry!" Kingsley's voice cut through the boy's escalating panic with calm authority. "Those things aren't your fault. You can't control them yet because no one has taught you how. They happen when you're scared or angry or upset, don't they?" The boy stared at him with something approaching wonder. You know about them." "I do. And there's nothing wrong with you for having magic, Harry." "Nothing at all." The effect of those words on the 8-year-old was immediate and devastating. Harry's thin face crumpled, and he began to cry with the silent, practiced manner of a child who had learned that loud sobs brought punishment. The tears were born of years of being told he was a freak, an aberration, something that needed to be hidden and contained and punished into normalcy. Kingsley felt something cold and dangerous settle in his stomach as he watched Harry Potter weep for the childhood he had never been allowed to have. "It's all right," Kingsley said softly, reaching into his pocket for a clean handkerchief. "You're going to be all right now." He spent the next hour conducting the most thorough interview of his career, his questions careful and methodical, while his fury grew with each answer. Harry told him about being locked in the cupboard for days at a time when his magic acted up, about being denied meals as punishment for asking questions about his parents, about Dudley and his gang using him for target practice while Vernon and Petunia looked the other way, about being forced to cook and clean from the age of 5 while being told constantly that he was a burden, a freak, to something to be ashamed of. With each revelation, Kingsley's mental report grew longer and more damning. The boy showed classic signs of chronic malnutrition, emotional abuse, and systematic neglect. His magical incidents were textbook examples of distress-induced accidental magic, the kind that occurred when magical children felt threatened or desperate. Most damning of all was Harry's response to basic kindness. When Kingsley conjured a small flower from his wand, a simple charm meant to demonstrate that magic could be beautiful as well as practical, Harry stared at it with such wonder that it was clear he had never been shown that his own abilities could create something lovely rather than destructive. "Uncle Vernon says magic is evil," Harry said, touching the flower's petals with reverent fingers. "That it ruins everything normal and good. Uncle Vernon," Kingsley said with barely controlled anger, "is wrong about a great many things." By mid-afternoon, Kingsley had documented enough evidence to justify emergency removal proceedings. He excused himself to use the Dursleys' telephone, ostensibly to call his office, but actually to step outside and send a priority owl to the ministry. The message he sent was brief and urgent. Emergency child protection case. Harry Potter. Systematic abuse confirmed. Request immediate backup and emergency placement authorization. Will maintain supervision until arrival. K. Shacklebolt. The response came faster than he had expected. A large, tawny owl landing on the fence behind the house within 30 minutes. The message it carried was signed by Amelia Bones herself. Emergency authorization granted. Team dispatching immediately. Document everything. Protect the child. A. Bones. When Kingsley returned to the house, he found the atmosphere had shifted ominously. Vernon was pacing the living room like a caged animal, his face purple with rage and barely contained panic. Petunia hovered near the kitchen doorway, wringing her hands and shooting nervous glances between her husband and the man who had invaded their carefully constructed world of secrets. "Now see here," Vernon blustered as soon as Kingsley entered. "You've seen the boy. He's fine, perfectly fine. A bit thin, perhaps, but some children are naturally small. No need for any more official involvement." "Mr. Dursley," Kingsley said, with the kind of calm that preceded storms, "Harry Potter has been living in a cupboard for 8 years. He's chronically malnourished, shows signs of systematic emotional abuse, and has been denied basic medical care. In what universe do you consider that fine?" Vernon's face went through several interesting color changes. "The boy is difficult," he said finally. "Unnatural. We've done our best with what we were given, but he's not normal. Brings nothing but trouble to decent people trying to live decent lives." "The trouble," Kingsley said with deadly quiet, "is not coming from an 8-year-old child who has been denied love, food, and basic human dignity for most of his life. The trouble is coming from 2 adults who have systematically abused their position as guardians." "We never hit him," Petunia said suddenly, her voice shrill with desperation. Not really. Vernon might have, but nothing serious. Nothing that left marks." Kingsley's eyes fixed on her with the intensity of a bird of prey. "Are you telling me that you did hit him?" The silence that followed was deafening. Vernon made a choking noise. Petunia went white as parchment, and from the hallway came a small, frightened sound that indicated Harry had been listening to the conversation. "I think," Kingsley said with the kind of professional calm that made hardened criminals confess their sins, "that we should continue this conversation when my colleagues arrive, which should be very soon." Vernon's response was immediate and explosive. "You can't take him!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the house. "Dumbledore placed him here, Dumbledore himself. Are you going to go against the greatest wizard in Britain?" "If necessary," Kingsley said simply, and the 2 words carried the weight of absolute conviction. It was then that Vernon Dursley made the mistake that sealed his fate. In his panic and rage, he turned toward the hallway where Harry was hidden and raised his voice in a way that made the boy visible shrink against the wall. "This is all your fault, you ungrateful little freak. Everything was fine until you started showing off with your abnormality." The red mist that had been building behind Kingsley's professional composure finally broke through his careful control. In 2 strides, he was between Vernon and Harry, and something in his expression made the larger man take an involuntary step backward. "Mr. Dursley," Kingsley said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout, "if you take 1 step toward that child, if you raise your voice to him again, if you so much as look at him the wrong way, I will arrest you for assault on a minor and make sure you spend the night in a cell with some people who have very strong opinions about adults who hurt children." The threat was delivered with such quiet conviction that Vernon actually paled beneath his bluster. Behind Kingsley, Harry had gone completely still, staring up at the tall aura with something that might have been the beginning of trust. For the first time in 8 years, someone had stood between Harry Potter and harm. For the first time in his short life, someone had made it clear that his safety mattered more than keeping the peace. And for Kingsley Shacklebolt, watching a small, abused boy take his first tentative step toward believing that adults could be protectors rather than threats, there was no question about what he would do next. He would stay until help arrived. He would document every detail. He would make sure that Harry Potter never spent another night in a cupboard. And then he would make sure that every person who had allowed this to happen faced the consequences of their choices. The revolution in Harry Potter's life was about to begin, and it would start with one simple principle. No child should have to live in fear of the people meant to love them. Not even the boy who lived. Chapter 4. Ministry Response. The ministry response team arrived at dawn like a storm breaking over Privet Drive. Kingsley had spent the night in the Dursleys' living room, now maintaining what he had told Vernon was protective custody, but what actually amounted to ensuring that Harry Potter would not spend another night locked in a cupboard. The boy had fallen asleep on the sofa around midnight, curled into a tight ball with the wariness of someone who had learned that sleep was dangerous, that unconsciousness meant vulnerability. Watching Harry's fitful rest, how he twitched at every sound, how his thin hands remained clenched even in sleep, had only strengthened Kingsley's resolve to see this through to its conclusion. The arrival of 6 ministry officials in the pre-dawn darkness was deliberately overwhelming. Amelia Bones led the team, her usually stern features set in lines of barely controlled anger as she surveyed the suburban street that had hidden 8 years of systematic abuse. And behind her came 2 additional auras, a ministry healer, a magical child protection specialist, and a documentation officer whose job was to ensure that every piece of evidence would hold up under the most rigorous legal scrutiny. "Shacklebolt," Bones said briskly as Kingsley met them at the garden gate. Her voice carried the crisp authority of someone who had built her career on protecting the vulnerable and prosecuting those who preyed upon them. "Status report. Systematic abuse confirmed," Kingsley replied, his professional mask firmly in place despite the fury that had been building in him all night. "The child has been living in a cupboard under the stairs since placement. Chronic malnutrition, emotional abuse, deliberate medical neglect." The Guardians have made several statements that could be construed as admissions of guilt. Bones's expression darkened further. "The child?" Frightened but cooperative. He's displaying classic signs of long-term trauma, flinching responses, hypervigilance, desperate attempts to please authority figures. He'll need careful handling. The team moved toward the house with the coordinated efficiency of professionals who had handled emergency child removals before, though Kingsley suspected none of them had ever dealt with a case quite like this one. The boy who lived was not just any magical child. He was a symbol, a hero, the foundation of their victory over Voldemort. The revelation that he had been systematically abused while the wizarding world celebrated his sacrifice would send shockwaves through every level of magical society. But inside the house, chaos erupted the moment Vernon Dursley saw the assembled officials. "What is the meaning of this?" he bellowed, his face already purpling with rage and panic. "You can't just invade a man's home. I'll call the police. I'll call my lawyer. Mr. Vernon Dursley," Amelia Bones interrupted, with the kind of voice that had silenced hardened criminals. "You are under arrest for child endangerment, systematic abuse of a minor, and violations of the Magical Children Protection Act of 1967. You have the right to remain silent, though I suspect you'll choose not to exercise that right." The effect on Vernon was immediate and dramatic. He went from purple to white to green in the space of seconds, his mouth opening and closing without producing sound. Behind him, Petunia made a noise like a deflating balloon and swayed against the doorframe. But it was Harry's reaction that broke Kingsley's heart. The boy had awakened at the first sound of raised voices, and now he stood in the hallway in his oversized pajamas, staring at the assembled adults with the kind of terror reserved for prey animals surrounded by predators. His green eyes were wide and darting between faces, his thin hands pressed against the wall as if he could disappear into it. "Harry," Kingsley said softly, moving slowly toward the frightened child. "These are friends. They're here to help. Remember what we talked about yesterday?" "I didn't do anything," Harry whispered, his voice barely audible over Vernon's increasingly desperate protests. "I've been good, I promise. I didn't make anything strange happen." The ministry healer, or a matronly woman named Frances Clearwater, knelt down to Harry's eye level with the practiced ease of someone who spent her career caring for traumatized children. "Hello, Harry," she said gently. "My name is Healer Clearwater. I'm here to make sure you're healthy and safe. No one is angry with you, and you're not in any trouble." "Really?" Harry's voice cracked on the word, and Kingsley felt something twist in his chest at the desperate hope in the boy's eyes. "Really," Healer Clearwater confirmed. "But I do need to examine you to make sure you're all right. Would that be okay?" While the healer began her assessment, the rest of the team set about their work with methodical precision. The documentation officer photographed every inch of Harry's cupboard, cataloguing the thin mattress, the few ragged belongings, of the spider webs in the corners that spoke to years of neglect. The child protection specialist interviewed Petunia, whose nervous answers painted a picture of deliberate deprivation disguised as discipline, and Amelia Bones herself took on Vernon Dursley. "Mr. Dursley," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "you will explain to me how a child under your guardianship came to be living in a cupboard." Vernon's response was a mixture of bluster and panic. "The boy is difficult, unnatural. We did our best with what we were given, but he's not normal. Strange things happen around him. Dangerous things. We had to keep him controlled for the safety of our own family." "So you locked an 8-year-old child in a cupboard. He had to learn, or had to understand that his freakishness wasn't acceptable in a decent household. Dumbledore said—" "Ah," Bones interrupted, her eyes sharpening with interest. "Dumbledore said what, exactly?" Vernon seemed to realize he had said something significant, but his panic was too great for careful consideration. "He said the boy had to stay here, had to be raised away from your lot. Said it was for his own protection that he had to learn to be normal." "And did Albus Dumbledore specify that this protection should involve starvation and confinement?" "He said—" Vernon's voice faltered as he met Bones's steady gaze. "He said the boy needed to learn humility, that he couldn't be allowed to think he was special." The silence that followed was profound. Every adult in the room turned to stare at Vernon Dursley, and the man seemed to shrink under the weight of their collective disgust. "Mr. Dursley," Amelia Bones said with deadly quiet, "you will be coming with us for formal questioning. Mrs. Dursley, you as well. And I think we'll need to have a very interesting conversation with Albus Dumbledore about his interpretation of child protection." The medical examination revealed what Kingsley had already suspected, but hoped against. Harry was significantly underweight for his age, showing signs of chronic malnutrition that would require months of careful treatment to correct. He had old injuries, poorly healed fractures in his ribs, untreated cuts that had scarred badly, evidence of repeated physical trauma that painted a picture of systematic abuse stretching back years. "This child," Healer Clearwater said quietly to Bones, or her professional composure cracked by anger, "has been deliberately starved. These injuries show patterns consistent with regular physical abuse, and the psychological trauma—" She shook her head. "It will take years to undo the damage that's been done." Meanwhile, the team conducting neighborhood interviews was uncovering a disturbing picture of willful blindness. Mrs. Number 5 admitted to hearing odd noises from the Dursley house, sounds of shouting, of something heavy being slammed repeatedly, of what might have been crying if she had bothered to investigate. Mr. Number 7 confirmed that he had never seen the Potter boy playing with other children, had noticed that the child seemed to do all the household maintenance despite his obvious youth. "Did it never occur to you to report these observations to authorities?" the interviewing officer asked. "Well," Mrs. Number 5 said uncomfortably, "it wasn't really our business, was it? The Dursleys are very private people, and the boy was always so polite when you did see him. Never caused any trouble. Because, Kingsley thought grimly, he had been terrorized into absolute submission." As the evidence mounted, Vernon Dursley's panic reached new heights. "You don't understand," he shouted, as the Aurors prepared to escort him to ministry holding cells. "We were doing what we were told. Dumbledore himself said the boy needed to be kept in line. We were following orders." "Orders," Amelia Bones repeated, with the kind of calm that preceded legal earthquakes. "To abuse a child. To keep him humble. To make sure he didn't get ideas above his station. Dumbledore said the boy couldn't be allowed to think he was better than normal people just because of his freakishness. Bones exchanged a look with Kingsley that promised significant developments in the very near future. Mr. Dursley, you'll have plenty of opportunity to explain these alleged instructions during your formal interview. I suspect the Wizengamot will be very interested in hearing about Albus Dumbledore's child-rearing philosophy. The removal itself was handled with as much care as possible, though there was no way to make it entirely easy for Harry. The boy clung to Kingsley's hand as they walked him out of the house he had known as home, however hellish that home had been, and loaded him into the ministry vehicle that would take him to emergency placement. "Where are we going?" Harry asked, his voice small and frightened as they drove away from Privet Drive. "Somewhere safe," Kingsley promised, though he was already composing the reports that would ensure this case received the highest possible priority. "Somewhere people will take care of you properly." "But what if I do something freakish? What if I cause trouble?" Kingsley looked down at the thin, frightened boy beside him and felt his resolve crystallize into something unbreakable. "Harry, the only trouble you've caused is making some very powerful people realize that our system failed you completely, and we're going to fix that failure, no matter who gets uncomfortable in the process." As they drove through the early morning streets toward Harry's new future, Kingsley made himself a promise. This case would not be quietly buried or diplomatically resolved. The people responsible for 8 years of systematic abuse would face justice, all of them, regardless of their position or reputation. Because Harry Potter deserved better than a cupboard under the stairs, and the wizarding world was about to learn that some failures were too profound to forgive. Chapter 5. Temporary Placement. Augusta Longbottom had faced down Death Eaters during the war without flinching. She had stared into the eyes of Bellatrix Lestrange as the woman tortured her son and daughter-in-law into madness and had never once begged for mercy. She had buried her husband with dry eyes and raised her traumatized grandson with unwavering determination. But the sight of Harry Potter, 8 years old, barely 40 pounds, and flinching every time an adult moved too quickly, nearly broke her legendary composure entirely. "Sweet Merlin," she whispered, as the ministry social worker led Harry into the sitting room at Longbottom Hall. The boy was clean now, dressed in clothes that actually fit him, thanks to a quick trip to Diagon Alley, but no amount of proper clothing could disguise the wariness in his green eyes or the way he held himself, as if preparing to run at the first sign of trouble. "Mrs. Longbottom," the social worker said, with the kind of careful professional tone that meant she had been briefed on exactly how serious this placement was. "This is Harry Potter. Harry, this is Mrs. Longbottom. She's going to take care of you while the ministry continues its investigation." Harry looked up at Augusta with the expression of someone waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Thank you, Mum," he said quietly, the words careful and practiced. "I'll try not to be any trouble." Augusta felt something fierce and protective flare in her chest. The boy was thanking her for basic human decency and promising not to be troublesome before he had even been shown where he would sleep. 8 years old and already convinced that his very existence was an imposition. "Nonsense," she said briskly, though she modulated her normally commanding tone to something gentler. "You're not trouble, young man. You're a guest in our home, and guests are welcome for as long as they need to stay." The social worker departed after completing the necessary paperwork, leaving Augusta alone with Harry and her grandson Neville, who had been hovering uncertainly in the doorway since Harry's arrival. The two boys stared at each other with the mutual fascination of children who recognized something familiar in each other's eyes. "Neville," Augusta said, drawing both boys' attention, "why don't you show Harry to his room while I prepare some lunch?" Harry's eyes widened. My room?" "Of course," Augusta said, matter-of-factly. "Everyone needs their own space. Neville will show you where everything is." As the boys disappeared up the stairs, Neville chattering nervously while Harry followed in cautious silence, Augusta made her way to the kitchen and began preparing what she privately thought of as a tactical meal. Nothing too rich that might upset a system accustomed to near starvation, but substantial enough to begin the long process of proper nourishment. When Kingsley arrived for his first check-in 3 hours later, he found Harry sitting at the kitchen table with a half-empty plate in front of him, staring at the food as if he couldn't quite believe it was really his to eat. "How are you settling in, Harry?" Kingsley asked, taking the seat across from him. "It's—" Harry paused, clearly searching for words to describe an experience so far outside his previous reality that he had no framework for it. "The room has a window. And books. Mrs. Longbottom said I could read any of them I wanted." "And have you?" "I asked 3 times if she was sure," Harry said solemnly. "She said yes every time, so I think she means it." Kingsley felt his heart clench. The boy was cautiously optimistic about being allowed to read books freely, a privilege so basic that most children took it entirely for granted. "Mrs. Longbottom is a woman of her word," Kingsley assured him. "If she says you can read the books, you can read the books." "Neville has his own room too," Harry continued, and there was wonder in his voice. "And his own bed. And his grandmother doesn't lock him anywhere when he does accidental magic. Or she just tells him it's normal, and he'll learn to control it someday." Augusta, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, stepped forward with the kind of expression that had once made Death Eaters reconsider their life choices. "Mr. Shacklebolt, might I have a word with you privately?" They stepped into Augusta's study, a room lined with books on magical lore, defense techniques, and political theory. Augusta closed the door with perhaps more force than strictly necessary. 8 years, she said without preamble, her voice vibrating with carefully controlled fury. 8 years that boy has been living like a prisoner. And where was the ministry? Where were the mandatory wellness checks? Where was anyone with 2 brain cells to rub together, asking whether the boy who lived was actually living? Kingsley had been expecting this conversation since the moment Augusta had agreed to emergency placement. Augusta Longbottom was not a woman to ignore institutional failures, particularly when those failures harmed children. "You're right," he said simply. "The system failed him completely." "Don't give me platitudes about the system," Augusta snapped. "Systems don't make decisions. People do. Someone placed that boy with relatives who should never have been trusted with a goldfish, let alone a traumatized child. Someone decided that no oversight was necessary. Someone chose to prioritize secrecy over safety." "Someone named Albus Dumbledore," Kingsley said quietly. Augusta's expression sharpened. "Let's explain." Kingsley related the details of Vernon Dursley's panicked admissions, Dumbledore's instructions about keeping Harry humble, about teaching him that he wasn't special, about the importance of him learning to be normal. Augusta's face grew more thunderous with each revelation. "Humble," she repeated, her voice deadly quiet. An 8-year-old child who survived the killing curse needed to be kept humble. According to Vernon Dursley, yes. And Dumbledore never checked on the boy's welfare? Never verified that his instructions were being followed appropriately? If he did, there's no record of it. No wellness checks, no school reports, no medical examinations. For all official purposes, Harry Potter disappeared the night he was placed with the Dursleys. Augusta was quiet for a long moment, and Kingsley could almost hear the gears of her formidable mind working through implications and consequences. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "That boy is not going back to those people. Not ever. If I have to fight the Ministry, Dumbledore, and the Wizengamot itself, Harry Potter will not spend another day in that house." "The emergency placement is only temporary," Kingsley warned. "Eventually, the court will need to make permanent arrangements." "Then we'd better make sure the court makes the right decision," Augusta said, with the kind of smile that had once made political opponents surrender before the debate began. "I assume you'll support a petition for permanent guardianship?" Without hesitation, Kingsley confirmed. But they returned to the kitchen to find Harry and Neville engaged in quiet conversation over shared plates of biscuits. The sight was so normal, so mundane, that it highlighted exactly how abnormal Harry's previous life had been. "Harry," Augusta said gently, "Mr. Shacklebolt tells me you've been having some accidental magic episodes. Would you like to tell me about them?" Harry's face went pale, and he shot a panicked glance toward Kingsley. "I didn't mean to," he said quickly. "I know it's wrong. I know I'm not supposed to—" "Harry," Augusta interrupted firmly but kindly, "magic is not wrong. Magic is part of who you are. Every magical child has accidents before they learn proper control. Neville once turned his great-uncle's hair bright pink during a family dinner." "I did," Neville confirmed solemnly. "Yes, Gran says it was an improvement." Harry stared between them with the expression of someone having their entire worldview reconstructed in real time. But Uncle Vernon said magic was evil, that it ruined everything good and normal. "Uncle Vernon," Augusta said with the kind of disdain usually reserved for something unpleasant stuck to one's shoe, "was wrong about a great many things. Magic is a gift, Harry. It can be used for wonderful things, healing, protection, creating beauty. The fact that you have magic makes you special, not wrong." The transformation in Harry's expression was subtle but profound. For the first time since Kingsley had met him, the boy looked less like a trapped animal and more like a curious child. Could you show me?" Harry asked hesitantly. "Something beautiful with magic?" Augusta's stern features softened into something approaching gentleness. She drew her wand, and with a subtle flick, conjured a small constellation of golden butterflies that danced through the air around Harry's head. The boy's face lit up with wonder, his green eyes tracking their movement with the kind of joy that should have been commonplace in an 8-year-old, but was heartbreakingly rare in this particular child. "Magic," Augusta said, as the butterflies settled on Harry's outstretched hands before dissolving into sparkles of light, "is meant to bring wonder into the world. Never let anyone tell you otherwise." Over the following days, Kingsley watched Harry begin the slow process of learning what normal childhood looked like. The meals appeared at regular intervals without being earned through chores or good behavior. Adults spoke to him with kindness rather than irritation. He was encouraged to play, to read, to ask questions, to be curious about the world around him. The changes were gradual but unmistakable. Harry gained weight, though he still ate with the urgency of someone who wasn't entirely convinced the food wouldn't be taken away. He slept better, though he still sometimes woke from nightmares with muffled cries. Most importantly, he began to show glimpses of the intelligence and magical talent that had been suppressed by years of systematic discouragement. When he accidentally made all the flowers in Augusta's garden bloom simultaneously during a particularly happy moment, which instead of punishment, he received an explanation of emotional magic and a promise to teach him proper control when he was older. When he asked if he could help with household chores because sitting idle made him nervous, Augusta assigned him age-appropriate tasks that were framed as helping the family rather than earning his keep. "He's a remarkable child," Healer Clearwater reported during one of her weekly examinations. "The physical recovery is proceeding well. He's gained 3 pounds and grown half an inch already. The psychological healing will take longer, but his resilience is extraordinary." "He's tough," Augusta agreed, watching through the window as Harry and Neville played an improvised game of magical tag in the garden. "But he shouldn't have had to be." Kingsley nodded. His own attention focused on the way Harry moved, still cautious, still ready to retreat at the first sign of trouble, but with moments of genuine childhood joy breaking through the defensive wariness. "Any word on the legal proceedings?" Augusta asked. "The Dursleys will face trial within the month," Kingsley replied. "Vernon is trying to claim he was following Dumbledore's explicit instructions. Amelia Bones has some very pointed questions for the Hogwarts headmaster." "Good," Augusta said with fierce satisfaction. It's past time someone held that man accountable for his decisions regarding Harry's welfare. As if summoned by their conversation, Harry appeared in the doorway, his clothes grass-stained from playing outside, his hair even more dishevelled than usual, but with colour in his cheeks and brightness in his eyes that spoke to proper nutrition and the absence of fear. "Mrs. Longbottom," he said politely, "is it really all right for me to take a bath whenever I want to, even if I had one yesterday?" Augusta's expression softened. "Of course, dear. Basic hygiene is not a privilege to be earned. It's a right." Harry nodded seriously, as if filing away yet another piece of information about how normal families functioned. "Thank you, Ma'am, and thank you for letting me stay here. I know I'm probably a lot of trouble." "Harry Potter," Augusta said firmly, "you are no trouble at all. You are a child who deserves safety, kindness, and care. Never apologize for needing those things." As Harry headed upstairs for his bath, Augusta turned to Kingsley with renewed determination. "Whatever it takes," she said quietly, "whatever legal battles we have to fight, whatever political pressure we have to apply, that boy is never going back to a cupboard." Kingsley nodded, watching Harry's small figure disappear up the stairs toward a warm bath, clean clothes, and a comfortable bed in a room with windows and books and the promise of breakfast in the morning. "No," he agreed. "He's not." Chapter 6. The Investigation widens. The files spread across Amelia Bones's desk told a story that made her question everything she thought she knew about institutional oversight and the protection of magical children. 3 weeks into what had begun as a routine child abuse case, she found herself staring at evidence of systematic failures that reached the highest levels of wizarding government. "Shacklebolt," she called to Kingsley, who was reviewing testimony transcripts in the corner of her office. "Tell me again about the placement documentation." Kingsley looked up from the thick folder of witness statements he had been organizing. Single document dated November 2nd, 1981. Signed by Dumbledore in his capacity as Chief Warlock. No supporting welfare assessments, no family background checks, no follow-up protocols. Just a placement order with extraordinary discretionary authority. Extraordinary how? Complete ministry oversight waiver. No mandatory wellness checks, no educational monitoring, no medical requirements. The document essentially places Harry Potter outside the normal child protection framework entirely. Amelia leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking under the weight of her growing frustration. Was in 25 years of magical law enforcement, she had never encountered a child placement order with such sweeping exemptions. Even children placed in witness protection maintained some level of ministry monitoring. Who else signed off on this? "That's where it gets interesting," Kingsley said, pulling out a second folder. "I've been interviewing the department heads who would normally be involved in magical child placements. None of them remember being consulted." Amelia's eyebrows rose. "None of them?" "Gerald Wickworth from Child Services says he was never asked to conduct a family assessment on the Dursleys. Helena Morrison from Magical Accidents and Catastrophes says no one requested monitoring protocols for underage magic incidents. Even Bartemius Crouch, from Magical Law Enforcement, says he wasn't consulted about security considerations. So Dumbledore placed the most famous magical child in Britain with Muggle relatives, with no background checks, no monitoring, and no consultation with the departments responsible for child welfare. It appears so. Amelia stared at the documents, her mind working through implications that grew more disturbing the longer she considered them. The placement of Harry Potter had circumvented every safeguard the Ministry had developed to protect magical children. Either Dumbledore had acted with unprecedented arrogance, or he had been deliberately concealing something about the placement that wouldn't withstand professional scrutiny. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, and was surprised to see Dr. Miranda Clearwater, the Ministry's leading expert on magical child psychology, accompanied by healer Francis Clearwater, who had been overseeing Harry's medical treatment. "Amelia," Dr. Clearwater said without preamble, "we need to talk about the psychological evaluation findings." The two women took seats across from Amelia's desk, their expressions grave in a way that made Amelia's stomach tighten with anticipation. "How bad is it?" Amelia asked directly. "Worse than we initially assessed," Dr. Clearwater replied. "The boy shows classic signs of complex developmental trauma, emotional dysregulation, hypervigilance, attachment disorders, learned helplessness. But what's particularly concerning is the degree to which his magical development has been impacted." Healer Clearwater nodded grimly. "His accidental magic incidents aren't just frequent, they're consistently defensive in nature. Magical children typically exhibit accidental magic across a range of emotions. Harry's magic appears to have been trained by trauma to activate almost exclusively in response to threat or desperation. Meaning his magical core has been essentially conditioned by 8 years of systematic abuse. Instead of developing healthy magical expression, his power has become a trauma response mechanism." Amelia felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Is that reversible?" "With proper care and therapy, yes, though it will take years. But Amelia, this isn't just neglect or even normal abuse. This is deliberate psychological conditioning of a magical child. The pattern suggests someone wanted to ensure that Harry's relationship with his own magic would be fraught with fear and self-doubt. The implications hung in the air like toxic smoke." Amelia looked between the two medical professionals, both of whom had decades of experience with traumatized magical children, and saw her own horrified suspicions reflected in their faces. "Are you suggesting this was intentional?" she asked quietly. Dr. Clearwater chose her words carefully. "I'm suggesting that the placement of a magical child with relatives who would systematically punish him for magical expression, combined with the complete absence of magical education or positive magical role models, or would predictably result in exactly the kind of magical psychological conditioning we're observing. Someone wanted Harry Potter to be afraid of his own magic. The evidence is consistent with that hypothesis." Amelia dismissed the healers after scheduling follow-up reports and immediately summoned her most trusted researcher. Within an hour, she had 3 junior investigators combing through every piece of legislation, every policy document, every procedural manual that governed the placement and monitoring of magical children. What they found was damning. The Magical Children Protection Act of 1967 was explicit. Any magical child placed outside the magical community required monthly wellness checks for the first year, quarterly checks thereafter until the age of 11, and immediate intervention if signs of magical suppression or abuse were detected. The Act provided no exceptions for special circumstances, no waivers for security considerations, no exemptions for prominent children. Dumbledore had ignored the law entirely. "Get me everything," Amelia ordered her team. "Every placement order Dumbledore has signed, every case where he's claimed extraordinary authority, every instance where normal protocols have been waived at his request. I want to know if this is an isolated incident or part of a pattern." Meanwhile, Kingsley had taken on a different line of investigation, one that threatened to undermine one of Dumbledore's primary justifications for the placement. "The blood ward magic," Kingsley reported during their evening briefing, "is theoretically sound but practically flexible. I've consulted with 3 independent experts on protective magic. All confirm that blood wards based on maternal sacrifice could be anchored to any location where a blood relative provided willing protection. Meaning, if Petunia Dursley had been willing to formally accept responsibility for Harry's safety, really accept it, not just house him, the wards could have been cast on any property she lived in. A supervised magical household, a ministry safe house, even a multi-family living arrangement. So the blood wards didn't require Harry to live with the Dursleys specifically. They required willing protection from a blood relative. Everything else was a choice. Amelia absorbed this information with growing anger. Dumbledore had placed Harry with relatives who despised and feared him, claiming magical necessity, that when the same protection could have been achieved in any number of safer arrangements. "There's more," Kingsley continued. "The ward experts all emphasized that blood ward magic requires genuine love and protection to be effective. Wards based on resentful compliance would be weak at best, useless at worst. So not only was the placement unnecessary, it was magically counterproductive. It appears so." The formal summons to Albus Dumbledore went out the next morning, delivered by official ministry owl to Hogwarts School. The message was brief and carried the weight of legal authority. "Professor Dumbledore, your presence is required at the Ministry of Magic on August 15th, 1989, at 2 p.m. to provide testimony regarding the placement and oversight of Harry James Potter. A failure to appear will result in a formal warrant for questioning. Amelia Bones, Head of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, acting under Emergency Child Protection Authority." The response came within hours, equally brief but infinitely more revealing. "Ms. Bones, I will attend as requested. I trust you understand that certain decisions regarding Harry Potter's welfare were made with information unavailable to standard ministry personnel. I look forward to explaining the full context of my choices. A P.W.B. Dumbledore." Amelia read the message twice, her lawyer's instincts prickling at the phrasing. Dumbledore was already positioning himself as having access to special knowledge that justified his actions, knowledge he apparently hadn't shared with the people legally responsible for child protection. That afternoon, she made an unscheduled visit to Longbottom Hall to check on Harry's progress, and, if she was honest, to remind herself exactly what was at stake in this investigation. She found Harry in the garden with Neville, both boys absorbed in what appeared to be an impromptu lesson in magical botany from Augusta. Harry had gained weight in the 3 weeks since his removal from Privet Drive. His face was fuller, his clothes fit properly, and most importantly, he was laughing at something Neville had said about a particularly stubborn flower that refused to bloom on command. "Mrs. Bones," Harry said when he noticed her approaching, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure. In 3 weeks, and the boy had learned to associate ministry officials with safety rather than trouble, a transformation that spoke to his remarkable resilience and the quality of care he was receiving. "Hello, Harry," Amelia said warmly. "How are you feeling?" "Good," Harry said, and seemed surprised by his own answer. "Really good. Mrs. Longbottom is teaching us about plants that respond to magic, and Neville knows loads about them already. And did you know some flowers only bloom when they're happy?" Augusta approached, wiping soil from her hands, with a satisfaction that suggested the afternoon's lessons had gone well. "He's a quick learner," she said proudly, "and he asks excellent questions. Very curious mind when it's allowed to develop properly." Amelia watched Harry return to his examination of the flowers, noting the way he moved with increasing confidence, the way he no longer flinched when adults approached him unexpectedly. The transformation was remarkable, but it also made the magnitude of what he had endured more starkly apparent. "Any word on the legal proceedings?" Augusta asked quietly, drawing Amelia aside while the boys continued their botanical exploration. "Dumbledore has been formally summoned for questioning. The Dursley trial is scheduled for next week, and I'm expanding the investigation to examine whether this case represents broader systemic failures in child protection oversight." Augusta's expression sharpened with interest. "Broader failures how?" "Dumbledore's placement of Harry violated several ministry laws regarding magical child welfare. I want to know if he's done this before. And I want to know how many other children might have slipped through the cracks because someone with political authority decided normal protections didn't apply." "Good," Augusta said with fierce satisfaction. "It's past time someone held him accountable for treating magical children like chess pieces in whatever game he thinks he's playing." As Amelia drove back to London that evening, she reflected on the growing scope of what had started as a single child abuse case. Harry Potter's rescue had opened a window into institutional failures that might stretch back years. Tomorrow, she would begin the formal process of holding one of the most powerful wizards in Britain accountable for decisions that had nearly destroyed the childhood of the boy they called their savior. The political ramifications would be enormous, or Dumbledore's reputation, his authority, his position as chief warlock, all of it would be called into question. But as she thought of Harry Potter laughing in a garden, learning about flowers that bloomed with happiness, Amelia found she didn't particularly care about the political consequences. Some things were more important than institutional comfort. Some things were worth whatever upheaval followed. And protecting magical children from the people who claimed to know what was best for them was definitely one of those things. The revolution was about to reach the highest levels of wizarding society, and Amelia Bones intended to make sure it counted. Chapter 7. Dumbledore's Defense. The Wizengamot Chamber had not hosted an emergency session for child protection proceedings in over 50 years. The circular room, aught with its tiered seating and ancient stone walls, typically heard cases of dark magic, international wizarding law violations, and matters of state security. Today, however, the assembled members of the wizarding world's highest court faced a case that threatened to shake the very foundations of their trust in institutional authority. Albus Dumbledore entered the chamber at precisely 2 o'clock, his tall figure commanding attention despite the circumstances that had brought him here. His blue robes were immaculate, his long silver beard carefully arranged, and his eyes held their characteristic twinkle, though Amelia Bones, watching from the prosecutor's table, noted that the twinkle seemed somewhat forced. "Professor Dumbledore," Chief Warlock Marchbanks said formally, her voice carrying throughout the chamber despite her advanced age, "while you appear before this emergency session to provide testimony regarding the placement and subsequent welfare of Harry James Potter. Do you understand the nature of these proceedings?" "I do, Chief Warlock," Dumbledore replied, his voice carrying its usual tone of calm authority. "Though I confess some confusion as to why decisions made in the immediate aftermath of the most catastrophic attack on our society in recent memory are now being subjected to such scrutiny." Amelia felt her jaw tighten at the deflection, but she had expected Dumbledore to attempt to frame his actions within the context of wartime emergency. She rose from her seat with the measured grace of someone who had spent decades prosecuting difficult cases. "Professor Dumbledore, you placed Harry Potter with his maternal relatives, the Dursleys, on November 1st, 1981. Oh, is that correct?" "It is." "And in making this placement, did you conduct any assessment of the Dursley family's suitability as guardians for a magical child?" Dumbledore's pause was brief but noticeable. "The circumstances were extraordinary, Miss Bones. The wizarding world was in chaos, dark wizards were still at large, and Harry Potter had just survived an attack that killed both his parents. My primary concern was ensuring his immediate safety." "I understand the urgency of the situation," Amelia said smoothly. "But my question was specific. Did you assess the Dursleys' suitability as guardians?" "I was aware that Petunia Dursley was Harry's aunt and only living magical relative. I was also aware that she had complicated feelings about the magical world." "Complicated feelings. Could you elaborate on that assessment?" Dumbledore shifted slightly, the first sign that his composure might not be as unshakable as it appeared. "Petunia had experienced some jealousy regarding her sister's magical abilities. I believed that caring for Harry might help her overcome those feelings and develop the familial bond necessary for his protection." A murmur ran through the Wizengamot at this admission. Several members exchanged glances that suggested they found this reasoning questionable at best. "Professor," Marchbanks interjected, "are you saying you placed a magical child with relatives you knew harbored resentment toward magic, hoping that caring for the child would change their feelings?" "I believed that love could triumph over prejudice," Dumbledore said, with the first hint of defensiveness in his tone. "Harry's mother died protecting him. That protection, rooted in love, could only be sustained by family willing to call him their own." "And did you monitor whether this love was developing?" Amelia asked pointedly. "The blood wards provided protection that was absolute. As long as Harry remained with Petunia, As long as he could call her home his home, he was safer than he could be anywhere else in the magical world. That wasn't my question, Professor. Did you monitor Harry's welfare with the Dursleys? The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. When Dumbledore finally spoke, his words were chosen with the precision of someone walking through a minefield. I believed that close monitoring might compromise the very protection I was seeking to maintain. The wards required genuine familial acceptance. Too much magical interference might have undermined that acceptance. Amelia felt a surge of professional satisfaction. She had maneuvered Dumbledore into admitting that he had deliberately avoided monitoring Harry's welfare, a violation of several ministry laws regarding magical child placement. So for 8 years, you conducted no welfare checks, no assessments of Harry's physical or emotional well-being, no evaluation of his living conditions or his guardian's treatment of him. I had other sources of information that assured me Harry was adequately cared for. What sources? Another pause. I occasionally observed from a distance. The boy appeared to be healthy and growing normally. Amelia exchanged a glance with Kingsley, who was seated in the witness section. They had prepared for this moment, and now it was time to present the evidence that would shatter Dumbledore's carefully constructed narrative. Chief Warlock, Amelia said, I would like to call Senior Auror Kingsley Shacklebolt to present his findings regarding Harry Potter's actual living conditions. Kingsley rose and approached the witness stand with the measured stride of a man who had testified in dozens of criminal cases. His testimony was methodical, devastating, and supported by extensive documentation. He described the cupboard under the stairs where Harry had lived for 8 years. He detailed the evidence of systematic starvation, emotional abuse, and deliberate suppression of magical expression. He presented medical reports documenting malnutrition, untreated injuries, and psychological trauma. With each piece of evidence, Dumbledore's expression grew more strained. The Wizengamot members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, several covering their faces as the full scope of Harry's abuse became clear. In your professional opinion as a senior Auror, Amelia asked when Kingsley had finished his report, was Harry Potter adequately cared for by the Dursley family? No, Kingsley said without hesitation. He was systematically abused and endangered. The conditions he was living in would constitute criminal neglect under both wizarding and Muggle law. Amelia turned back to Dumbledore. Professor, having heard this testimony, do you still maintain that your placement decision was appropriate? Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded before him, his usually bright eyes shadowed with something that might have been regret. When he spoke, his voice had lost its customary confidence. The blood protection was real, he said slowly. It kept Harry safe from dark wizards who would have killed him. Perhaps I should have monitored more closely. Perhaps I should have intervened when I suspected all was not well. You suspected? The question came from Augusta Longbottom, who had risen from her seat in the gallery with the kind of controlled fury that made seasoned politicians step carefully around her. Augusta, Marchbanks said, you're not recognized to speak. I am Harry Potter's current legal guardian, Augusta said, with deadly calm. And I have something to say about the man who condemned him to 8 years of abuse in the name of protection. The chamber erupted in murmurs. Emergency guardianship proceedings were typically private. No, but Augusta's declaration that she had formal custody of Harry Potter sent ripples of surprise through the assembled wizards. You may address the Wizengamot, Marchbanks said, after a moment's consideration. Augusta descended to the chamber floor with the regal bearing of someone born to command respect. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of generations of pure-blood political power and the righteous fury of a grandmother protecting her children. Professor Dumbledore, you have just admitted that you suspected Harry Potter was being mistreated and chose to do nothing about it. You prioritized theoretical magical protection over the actual physical safety of a child. You allowed an 8-year-old boy to be systematically abused because intervening might have inconvenienced your plans. Mrs. Longbottom, Dumbledore began, make the greater good. Don't you dare speak to me about the greater good, Augusta interrupted, her voice cutting across the chamber like a blade. I have seen what your notion of the greater good produces. My son and daughter-in-law were tortured into madness by Death Eaters. My grandson still wakes up screaming from nightmares about his parents' condition. But never, not once, did it occur to me to sacrifice Harry Potter's childhood to make my family's healing easier. The chamber was absolutely silent. Dumbledore's face had gone pale, and several Wizengamot members were staring at him with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright disgust. Harry Potter was placed in my emergency care 3 weeks ago, Augusta continued. In that time, he has gained 4 pounds and grown an inch. He has learned that magic is not evil, or that adults can be trusted to protect him, and that he deserves kindness without having to earn it through perfect behavior. In 3 weeks, Mrs. Dumbledore, 3 weeks of actual care have begun to undo 8 years of the protection you provided. She paused, allowing her words to sink in before delivering her final blow. You failed that child completely. You failed in your duty as Chief Warlock, as an educator, and as a human being. And your failure was not an accident or an oversight, it was a choice. You chose to prioritize your own theories about magical protection over the lived reality of a child's suffering. The silence that followed Augusta's statement stretched for nearly a minute. Finally, Marchbanks spoke, her voice heavy with the weight of institutional disappointment. Professor Dumbledore, this Wizengamot finds your actions regarding the placement and oversight of Harry Potter to be grossly negligent and in violation of multiple statutes governing magical child welfare. While we acknowledge the extraordinary circumstances surrounding the initial placement, we cannot excuse 8 years of deliberate inattention to a child's basic welfare. She paused, consulting with several other senior members before continuing. This body votes to formally censure your actions and to remove all authority you may claim over Harry Potter's future care and education. Furthermore, we mandate a comprehensive review of all child placement decisions made under your authority to ensure no other magical children have been similarly endangered. The vote was swift and decisive, 37 in favor of censure, 8 opposed, 3 abstentions. Of the most powerful wizard in Britain, had been formally rebuked by his peers for failing in his most basic obligation, protecting a child. Dumbledore accepted the verdict with visible grace, though his usual confidence had been thoroughly shaken. I accept the judgment of this body, he said quietly, and I accept full responsibility for my failures regarding Harry Potter's welfare. As the session adjourned, Amelia gathered her files with the satisfaction of a prosecutor who had achieved justice through evidence and law rather than political maneuvering. The formal censure would have far-reaching implications for Dumbledore's political authority and his ability to make unilateral decisions about the lives of others. But more importantly, it meant that Harry Potter would never again be treated as a chess piece in someone else's game, and the boy who had survived the killing curse had finally been recognized as what he had always been, a child deserving of protection, care, and the chance to grow up safe. The revolution was complete. Now the healing could truly begin. Chapter 8. New Guardianship. The courtroom was smaller than the Wizengamot chamber, but it carried an atmosphere of quiet authority that made Harry shift nervously in his seat. He had been in this building before, the Ministry's family court division, but today felt different. Today people were going to ask him what he wanted, and for the first time in his 8 years of life, his answer might actually matter. Augusta sat beside him, her presence a steady anchor in the formal proceedings that swirled around him with confusing legal terminology and procedural requirements. She had explained everything to him the night before, her voice gentle but clear. Today, the court would officially dissolve the Dursley guardianship, and, if everything went well, grant her permanent custody of him. "But Harry," she had said, her weathered hands covering his smaller ones, "the most important thing is that they're going to ask you what you want. Not what adults think is best for you, not what's most convenient for everyone else, what you want, and whatever you say will be respected." The concept was so foreign that Harry had stared at her for a full minute, trying to process the idea that his preferences might be considered in decisions about his own life. "Really?" he had whispered. "Really?" Augusta had confirmed, and the certainty in her voice had made something tight and fearful in Harry's chest begin to ease. Now, sitting in the courtroom watching official-looking adults shuffle papers and speak in hushed tones, Harry found himself thinking about what he actually wanted. Not what would keep him safe, not what would avoid punishment, but what would make him happy. The realization that he was allowed to want to be happy was still so new that it made him dizzy. "The court recognizes Mrs. Augusta Longbottom," announced Judge Patricia Clearwater, a stern-faced witch whose no-nonsense demeanor was softened by kind eyes that reminded Harry of Healer Clearwater. "You are petitioning for permanent guardianship of Harry James Potter." "I am, Your Honor," Augusta replied, rising with the natural grace of someone comfortable in formal settings. "I believe I can provide the stability, care, and protection that Harry needs to recover from his traumatic experiences and develop into a healthy, confident young man." "And you understand the full scope of responsibility you're undertaking? Mr. Potter will require ongoing medical care, psychological support, and careful attention to his educational and magical development." "I do, Your Honor. I have already been providing that care during his emergency placement, and I am prepared to continue for as long as Harry needs." Judge Clearwater nodded and consulted her notes. "The court has received character references from several witnesses. Senior Aura Shacklebolt, please approach." Kingsley stepped forward with the measured confidence Harry had come to associate with him. Over the past month, the Kingsley's regular visits had become something Harry looked forward to, a connection to the man who had first shown him that adults could be protectors rather than threats. "Senior Aura Shacklebolt, you have observed Harry Potter's placement with Mrs. Longbottom. In your professional opinion, is this arrangement serving the child's best interests?" "Unequivocally, Your Honor," Kingsley replied without hesitation. "When I first encountered Harry Potter, he was severely malnourished, psychologically traumatized, and conditioned to expect punishment for the most basic expressions of childhood. Under Mrs. Longbottom's care, he has gained weight, begun to trust adults, and started expressing natural curiosity and magical ability. Can you elaborate on his progress?" Kingsley's expression softened slightly as his professional demeanor gave way to genuine care. "Harry is learning what it means to be a child, Your Honor. He's discovering that he's allowed to ask questions, to make mistakes, to have preferences. Mrs. Longbottom has provided not just physical care, but emotional security. She has shown Harry that he has value beyond his usefulness, that he deserves love without having to earn it through perfect behavior." Harry felt heat rise in his cheeks, both from the praise and from the strange experience of hearing adults talk about his needs as if they mattered. In the Dursley house, conversations about Harry had always focused on what a burden he was, how much trouble he caused. Or this was entirely different. "The court will now speak with Mr. Potter privately," Judge Clearwater announced. "All other parties will wait outside while I conduct the interview." The courtroom emptied, except for Harry, the judge, and a court-appointed advocate, a kind-faced wizard named Mr. Weston, who had introduced himself earlier as someone whose job was to make sure Harry's voice was heard in these proceedings. "Hello, Harry," Judge Clearwater said, her formal tone warming considerably now that they were alone. "I know this might feel overwhelming, but I want you to know that this conversation is just for us. No one else will hear what you say unless you want them to, and there are no right or wrong answers. I just want to understand how you're feeling and what you want for your future." Harry nodded, though he still felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that came with adult attention. Even after a month of kindness from Augusta and Neville, part of him remained convinced that he was one wrong answer away from disaster. "Can you tell me about living with Mrs. Longbottom?" the judge asked gently. Harry paused, searching for words to describe an experience so far outside his previous reality that he had no framework for comparison. "It's nice. Really nice. She gives me my own room, and there are books everywhere, and she never gets angry when I ask questions. And Neville is kind to me, even though I don't know very much about magic yet." "Are you happy there?" The question was so direct that Harry blinked in surprise. Am I allowed to be happy?" Judge Clearwater's expression softened with something that might have been sadness. "Oh, sweetheart, of course you're allowed to be happy. Being happy is what childhood is supposed to be about." "Then yes," Harry said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "Yes, I'm happy there. Happier than I've ever been. And if you could choose where to live, what would you choose?" "I want to stay with Mrs. Longbottom," Harry said immediately, then caught himself and added more quietly, "if she wants me to stay." "Why do you want to stay with her?" Harry considered this, trying to put into words the transformation that had occurred in his life since arriving at Longbottom Hall. "She makes me feel safe. Not just physically safe, but like it's okay to be myself. She tells me that having magic makes me special in a good way, not in a freakish way. And she never looks at me like I'm a burden or like she's waiting for me to cause trouble." "Has anyone ever made you feel like a burden before?" The question opened a door to memories that still made Harry's stomach clench with anxiety. "My aunt and uncle always said I was ungrateful and troublesome, that I cost too much and caused too much problems, and that I should be grateful they bothered to keep me at all. But Mrs. Longbottom says I'm not any of those things. She says I'm just a little boy who deserves to be cared for." Judge Clearwater was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was very gentle. "Harry, if Mrs. Longbottom is granted guardianship of you, that would mean she becomes legally responsible for you until you're grown up. You would live with her permanently, not just temporarily. Does that sound like something you want?" "More than anything," Harry said, and the certainty in his own voice surprised him. For 8 years he had focused purely on survival, on getting through each day without making things worse. The idea that he could want something, and might actually get it, was still almost too wonderful to believe. "All right," Judge Clearwater said with a smile that transformed her stern features. "Let's bring everyone back in." The formal proceedings that followed felt like a blur of legal language and official stamps, but Harry understood the important parts. Vernon Dursley had been sentenced to 2 years in Azkaban for child endangerment and abuse. Petunia had received a suspended sentence with mandatory counseling, her punishment reduced because she had never directly participated in the physical abuse and had shown genuine remorse for her failure to protect Harry. More importantly, Augusta Longbottom was officially granted permanent guardianship of Harry James Potter, with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. "The court finds," Judge Clearwater announced formally, "that Mrs. Longbottom has demonstrated exceptional capability as a guardian, and that placement with her serves the best interests of the child. The guardianship is granted permanently, with the understanding that Mr. Potter's welfare will continue to be monitored by appropriate ministry departments to ensure his continued recovery and development." The gavel fell with a finality that seemed to echo through Harry's entire being. He was officially, legally, permanently part of the Longbottom family. Augusta's hand found his immediately, squeezing gently as tears threatened to overwhelm him. Not tears of sadness, but tears of relief so profound that they seemed to come from somewhere deep in his soul where an 8-year-old boy had been holding his breath for most of his life. The celebration that evening at Longbottom Hall was modest but heartfelt. Neville had convinced his grandmother to make Harry's favourite dinner, shepherd's pie with extra vegetables that Harry was still learning to enjoy after years of inadequate nutrition. Kingsley joined them, bringing a small wrapped gift that turned out to be a journal with Harry's initials embossed on the cover. "For writing down your thoughts," Kingsley explained, "or your dreams for the future. Now that you have a future that's truly your own." That night, as Harry sat in his room, legally and officially his, he opened the journal and stared at the blank page. For the first time in his life, he tried to imagine what he wanted to become, what he wanted to learn, what kind of person he wanted to be. The possibilities felt endless and terrifying and wonderful all at once. He picked up his pen and wrote his first entry. "My name is Harry Potter. I am 8 years old. I live with Augusta and Neville Longbottom, who are my family now. I am safe, and I am loved, and I am allowed to be happy. I think I want to learn everything about magic. I want to understand how the flowers know when to bloom, and how healing works, and maybe someday I want to help other kids who are scared and alone, like I used to be. I don't know what will happen next, but for the first time, I'm excited to find out." He closed the journal and placed it carefully on his bedside table, next to the books Augusta had given him, and the small magical light Neville had made for him in their last botany lesson. Tomorrow, he would wake up in his own bed, in his own room, in a house where people wanted him to be happy. He would eat breakfast without having to earn it, ask questions without fear of punishment, and continue the slow, wonderful process of learning what it meant to be Harry Potter. Not the boy who lived, not a burden or a freak, but simply a child with magic in his blood and infinite possibilities ahead of him. For the first time in 8 years, Harry Potter fell asleep planning for the future instead of merely hoping to survive another day. Chapter 9. Preparing for Hogwarts. The morning of July 31st, 1989, Harry Potter woke up to something he had never experienced before. People who were excited about his birthday. He lay in his bed, in his room, with sunlight streaming through windows that he was allowed to open whenever he wanted, and listened to the sounds of preparation coming from downstairs. Augusta's voice, directing someone to be careful with something fragile. Neville's excited chatter about decorations and cake. Even the house elf, Pip, seemed to be bustling about with more energy than usual. For 9 years, Harry's birthday had been either ignored entirely or actively resented by the Dursleys, who treated July 31st as an unwelcome reminder of the burden they had been forced to bear. Today, for the first time, his birthday was being treated as something worth celebrating. The concept was still so foreign that Harry had to take several deep breaths to believe it was real. When he finally made his way downstairs, the kitchen had been transformed with magical decorations that shifted and sparkled in the morning light. A banner reading, "Happy 9th Birthday, Harry," hung above the table, and his place was set with a stack of wrapped packages that made his eyes widen with wonder. "Happy birthday, dear," Augusta said warmly, pulling him into a hug that he no longer flinched away from. "How does it feel to be 9? "Good," Harry said, but then reconsidered. "Really good. Better than any birthday I've ever had." "Well, this is just the beginning," Augusta promised. "We have quite a day planned for you." The gifts were modest, but chosen with care that spoke to how well Augusta and Neville had come to know him. Books about magical creatures and basic spell theory, art supplies for drawing the magical plants he had become fascinated with, and from Kingsley, who arrived just as Harry was opening his presents, a small practice wand designed for children to learn proper wand movement without producing actual magic. "Not a real wand yet," Kingsley explained, as Harry turned the practice wand over in his hands with reverent care. But it will help you learn the proper motions and develop the muscle memory you'll need when you get your real wand." "When will that be?" Harry asked, then caught himself. "I mean, if I'm allowed to have a real wand someday." Augusta and Kingsley exchanged a glance that Harry was learning to recognize, the look adults gave each other when they were reminded of just how thoroughly the Dursleys had convinced him that magical education was a privilege he couldn't expect to receive. "Harry," Augusta said gently, "you will attend Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry when you turn 11, just like every other magical child in Britain. You'll get your real wand then, along with all your school supplies and books. It's not something you have to earn or hope for, it's your right." "But what if I'm not ready?" Harry asked, and voicing the anxiety that had been growing as he learned more about the magical world he would someday join. "What if I don't know enough? The Dursleys never taught me much of anything, and I've only been learning about magic for a few months." "That," said a crisp Scottish voice from the kitchen doorway, "is precisely why we're here to discuss your educational preparation." Harry turned to see a stern-faced woman in dark green robes, her hair pulled back in a tight bun and her eyes sharp with intelligence. She carried herself with the kind of authority that spoke to years of commanding classrooms full of unruly students. "Harry," Augusta said, "this is Professor McGonagall from Hogwarts. She's here to help us plan your education for the next 2 years, so that you'll be fully prepared for magical schooling when the time comes." Professor McGonagall's expression softened as she studied Harry, taking in his still thin frame and the lingering wariness in his eyes that spoke to years of educational neglect. "Mr. Potter," she said, her voice considerably gentler than her initial tone, "I understand you've had some gaps in your early education. We're here to remedy that situation." Over the course of the morning, Professor McGonagall conducted a thorough assessment of Harry's educational level, testing his reading, writing, arithmetic, and general knowledge. The results were both encouraging and concerning. Harry was bright and curious, with a natural intelligence that had survived 8 years of systematic discouragement, but he was significantly behind where a 9-year-old should be academically. "The good news," McGonagall explained to Augusta and Harry after completing her evaluation, "is that Mr. Potter shows no signs of learning difficulties. His gaps are purely the result of inadequate instruction, not inability to learn. With proper tutoring and support, he can absolutely catch up to his age group before beginning magical education." "What would that involve?" Augusta asked. "A structured program focusing on reading comprehension, mathematical skills, basic sciences, and general knowledge about both the magical and non-magical worlds. I would recommend daily tutoring sessions, along with educational outings to museums, historical sites, and magical locations to broaden his understanding of the world he'll be entering." Harry listened with growing amazement as the two women discussed his educational needs as if they were important, as if his future success was something worth investing time and effort in. The contrast with the Dursleys' approach, where his education had been treated as an unwelcome burden, was so stark that he felt slightly dizzy. "Of course," McGonagall continued, "we'll also want to begin some basic magical theory. Nothing that requires a wand, but fundamental concepts about how magic works, the structure of the wizarding world, and basic magical history. By the time Mr. Potter arrives at Hogwarts, he should feel confident in his knowledge base rather than overwhelmed by unfamiliarity." The afternoon brought a trip to Diagon Alley that was part birthday celebration, part educational expedition. Augusta had arranged for them to visit not just the shops, but also some of the educational and cultural sites that most magical children took for granted, but which would be completely new to Harry. Walking through the cobbled streets of magical London, Harry felt a sense of belonging that was entirely new to him. This was his world, the world he had been denied access to for the first 8 years of his life. The sight of wizards and witches going about their daily business, of magical shops selling impossible things, of children his own age practicing simple spells under their parents' supervision, and filled him with a wonder that never quite dimmed. "This will all be normal to you someday," Augusta said, watching his awed expression as they passed a shop window full of self-stirring cauldrons. "But I hope you never lose the ability to see the magic in it." They visited Flourish and Blotts, where Augusta purchased a carefully selected collection of age-appropriate magical texts that would support Harry's educational preparation. At Quality Quidditch Supplies, Neville excitedly explained the rules of wizard sports, while Harry stared in fascination at flying broomsticks. They stopped at Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlour, where the proprietor regaled Harry with stories about magical confectionery, while he devoured the first ice cream anyone had ever bought specifically for him. "The key," Augusta explained as they walked, "is to give you exposure to all of this gradually, so that when you do start at Hogwarts, you're not overwhelmed by the unfamiliarity of it all." That evening, Kingsley joined them for birthday dinner, bringing with him stories about aura training and the various career paths available to magical people. Harry listened with growing excitement as Kingsley described the different magical professions: healers, magizoologists, curse breakers, researchers, teachers. "What do you think you might want to do when you grow up?" Kingsley asked. Harry considered the question seriously, marveling at the fact that he was being asked to think about his future as something he could actively choose rather than something that would simply happen to him. "I think," he said slowly, "I'd like to help people. Maybe be an aura like you, or a healer like Madame Clearwater. I want to make sure other children don't have to go through what I went through." "Those are admirable goals," Kingsley said warmly, "and with proper education and training, there's no reason you couldn't achieve them." Later that night, as Harry sat in his room, reflecting on the day, he realized that he was no longer just surviving from one day to the next. For the first time in his life, he was actively planning for a future that held possibilities, rather than just more of the same fear and uncertainty. He opened the journal Kingsley had given him and began writing. "Today I turned 9. I had a real birthday party with cake and presents, and people who were happy to celebrate with me. Professor McGonagall came to evaluate my education and make plans to help me catch up before I start Hogwarts in 2 years. 2 years feels like a long time, but Augusta says it will go quickly. She's going to hire tutors to help me learn everything I should have learned already. We're going to visit museums and historical sites and magical places so I can understand the world better. I'm excited about Hogwarts, but also nervous. What if the other children are much smarter than me? What if they all know things I don't? Augusta says that everyone starts somewhere, and that being behind doesn't mean staying behind, but sometimes I still worry. Kingsley says I should think about what I want to do when I grow up. I've never been allowed to think about that before. It feels strange but good to imagine having choices about my life. I want to help people. I want to make sure no other children have to live in cupboards or go hungry or be told they're freaks for having magic. Maybe I can be an aura and protect people, or maybe I can work with magical children somehow. I don't know exactly what will happen, but for the first time, I'm excited to find out. I feel like Harry Potter, not the boy who lived, not the freak, just Harry. And Harry has a future full of possibilities. He closed the journal and placed it on his bedside table, next to the practice wand that represented his first real step toward magical education. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new discoveries, and continued preparation for the magical world that was finally, truly his to claim. For the first time in 9 years, Dr. Harry Potter fell asleep on his birthday, feeling genuinely excited about growing up. Chapter 10. Hogwarts Arrival. The Hogwarts Express pulled into Hogsmeade Station with a great hiss of steam and the excited chatter of hundreds of young witches and wizards. Harry Potter stepped onto the platform beside Neville Longbottom, both boys carrying themselves with the easy confidence of children who had spent the summer preparing for this moment with proper support and genuine excitement rather than fear and uncertainty. The past 2 years had transformed Harry in ways that would have been impossible to imagine during his time with the Dursleys. At 11 years old, he stood tall for his age, his frame filled out with proper nutrition, and his green eyes bright with curiosity rather than the wariness that had once defined him. His hair was still perpetually messy, but it was clean and well cut, framing a face that had learned to expect kindness rather than criticism from the adults around him. "Look at it," Harry breathed, staring up at Hogwarts Castle as it came into view across the lake. The sight was every bit as magnificent as Augusta had described, but seeing it with his own eyes, knowing that this was where he belonged, where he had a right to be, filled him with a wonder that had nothing to do with fear. "Better than the pictures in the books," Neville agreed, and Harry could hear the same mixture of excitement and nervousness in his almost brother's voice. They had spent countless hours over the past 2 years reading about Hogwarts, learning its history, understanding its traditions. Unlike his canonical arrival, dear Harry was stepping into a world he understood rather than one that bewildered him. The boat ride across the lake was magical in every sense of the word, but Harry found himself noticing details that most first years missed. The careful charms that kept the boats stable, the way the castle's lights reflected off the water in patterns that suggested protective enchantments, the subtle magic that permeated everything about this place that was now his school. Professor McGonagall greeted the first years with her usual stern efficiency, but Harry caught the slight softening in her expression when her eyes found him in the crowd. Over the past 2 years, she had become more than an educational consultant. She had been a mentor and guide, helping him prepare not just academically, but emotionally for the transition to magical education. "Potter." "Harry!" she called during the Q formation, and Harry stepped forward with calm confidence rather than the terrified hesitation that had marked his canonical arrival. The whispers started immediately. "That's him? Harry Potter? He's not what I expected. Looks too normal to be the boy who lived. I heard he was rescued from terrible relatives." Harry had learned to tune out the whispers about his fame, though these carried a different tone than he might have expected. 2 years of living in the magical world, of being treated as a person rather than a celebrity, had given him perspective on his unwanted notoriety that he wouldn't have had otherwise. The Great Hall was every bit as magnificent as Augusta had described, and Harry found himself able to appreciate its beauty rather than being overwhelmed by it. He caught sight of the Longbottom family coat of arms among the banners, a reminder that he belonged here not just as Harry Potter, the famous boy, but as a member of a family with deep roots in this world. The Sorting Hat's song was exactly as tradition demanded, and when Professor McGonagall began calling names for sorting, Harry listened with the kind of attention that came from genuine preparation rather than bewildered confusion. "Granger Hermione," McGonagall called, and a bushy-haired girl with bright eyes and an eager expression practically bounced forward to the stool. The hat barely touched her head before declaring, "Gryffindor," and she hurried to the red and gold table with obvious satisfaction. Longbottom, Neville came next, and Harry watched his brother, for that's how he thought of Neville now, approach the stool with nervous but determined steps. The sorting took longer than Hermione's had, but when the hat finally called Gryffindor, Harry felt a surge of genuine happiness for his friend. When Potter, Harry, rang through the great hall, the whispers stopped entirely. Every eye in the hall turned to watch as Harry walked calmly to the stool, his posture straight and his expression composed. He had learned over the past 2 years to carry himself with quiet confidence, rather than the hunched defensiveness that had once defined his body language. The Sorting Hat settled on his head, and immediately Harry felt the ancient magic probing at his thoughts. "Well, well," the Hat's voice spoke directly into his mind, carrying traces of surprised approval. "Young Mr. Potter, you're quite different from what I expected to find." "How so, sir?" Harry thought back, having been prepared by Augusta for the possibility of mental communication with the hat. 2 years ago, I would have found a mind scarred by trauma, desperate for acceptance, willing to be shaped by whoever showed him kindness. Instead, I find confidence, genuine curiosity, and most remarkably, a clear sense of your own identity. Someone has done exceptional work helping you heal. Harry felt a flush of gratitude toward Augusta, Neville, Kingsley, and all the people who had helped him become who he was now, rather than merely surviving what he had been. "You have courage," the hat continued, "but it's not the desperate recklessness of someone with nothing to lose. You have intelligence, but it's been properly nurtured rather than suppressed. And you have loyalty, but to people who have earned it through genuine care rather than to those who demand it through authority alone." "Where do I belong?" Harry asked. "Where you have always belonged," the hat replied, with what might have been amusement. "But now you go there as yourself, rather than as who others expect you to be. Gryffindor." The great hall erupted in cheers, with the Gryffindor table particularly enthusiastic. Harry made his way to the red and gold table with a smile that was genuinely his own, settling beside Neville with the easy comfort of family. "Weasley, Ronald," McGonagall called, and a red-headed boy with a smattering of freckles approached the stool with obvious nervousness. The hat sorted him quickly into Gryffindor as well, and he took the seat across from Harry with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. "Blimey," Ron said quietly, staring at Harry with wide eyes. "You're Harry Potter. I know everyone knows that. But, well, you're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Harry asked, with genuine curiosity rather than defensiveness. 2 years of stable relationships had taught him that most people's preconceptions came from ignorance rather than malice. "Well, my mum always talked about you like you were this tragic figure, you know. The poor orphaned boy who defeated you-know-who but paid such a terrible price. But you seem—" Ron paused, searching for words. "Normal?" Harry suggested with a slight smile. "Happy," Ron said instead. "Like, genuinely happy. It's nice. Makes you seem more real, if that makes sense." Before Harry could respond, Hermione Granger appeared at his elbow, with the determined expression of someone who had been waiting all evening for the chance to introduce herself properly. "Harry Potter," she said, extending her hand with brisk efficiency. "I'm Hermione Granger. I've read about you, of course, but I have to say, the books made it sound like your childhood was absolutely dreadful. You don't seem traumatized at all." "The books don't know the whole story," Harry said diplomatically, shaking her hand with the easy social skills Augusta had helped him develop. "I was fortunate to find a proper family when I needed one." "The Longbottoms, right?" Hermione said, her eyes bright with the kind of intellectual curiosity that Harry had learned to appreciate rather than fear. "I read about the custody case in the Prophet Archives. Quite the scandal, from what I could gather, though the details were kept deliberately vague." Harry exchanged a glance with Neville, both boys having learned to navigate the complex social dynamics around Harry's fame and the circumstances of his rescue. They had practiced these conversations under Augusta's guidance, learning to be honest without being vulnerable to people who didn't yet deserve their trust. "It worked out for the best," Harry said simply. "Augusta Longbottom is the finest guardian anyone could ask for." The conversation was interrupted by the start of the feast, but Harry noticed how different this entire experience was from what it might have been. Instead of desperate gratitude for any friendship offered, he was evaluating Ron and Hermione as potential friends with the confidence of someone who already knew he was valued and cared for. Instead of being overwhelmed by the magical feast, he was able to appreciate it as another wonderful part of the world he now belonged to. Professor Snape's reaction to his appearance was perhaps the most telling difference of all. When the potions master's dark eyes found Harry across the great hall, the expression that crossed his face was one of genuine shock. This was not the scrawny, terrorized, ignorant boy Snape had clearly expected to see. This was a confident young wizard who looked well cared for, properly educated, and entirely comfortable with his place in the magical world. And the shock in Snape's expression lasted only a moment before being replaced by something more complex, perhaps disappointment that his anticipated opportunity to belittle James Potter's son had been undermined by the boy's obvious competence and confidence. Even more interesting was Dumbledore's reaction. The headmaster's eyes found Harry early in the feast and remained on him with an expression of what could only be described as complicated regret. Here was the boy Dumbledore had placed with the Dursleys to be kept humble and ignorant of his fame, now sitting at the Gryffindor table with quiet confidence, engaging easily with his peers, and showing every sign of being exactly the kind of student Hogwarts was meant to educate. After the feast, as the first years were led to their dormitories, Harry found himself walking with Ron and Hermione, the three of them falling into easy conversation about their expectations for classes and their excitement about finally beginning their magical education. "I've been preparing for this for 2 years," Harry confided, as they climbed the stairs to Gryffindor Tower. "Reading, studying, practicing basic theory. I can't wait to start actually doing magic with a real wand." 2 years? Hermione asked with interest. "Most students don't start preparing until they get their Hogwarts letter." "I had some catching up to do," Harry said simply. "My previous guardians weren't particularly interested in education." In the Gryffindor common room, Harry took a moment to appreciate how comfortable he felt in this space that was supposed to be completely new to him. 2 years of living in magical households, of visiting magical locations, of being treated as a young wizard rather than a freak or a burden, had given him a sense of belonging that transcended mere familiarity. That night, as he settled into his dormitory bed, Harry opened the small writing desk Augusta had given him and composed his first letter home from Hogwarts. "Dear Augusta, Neville, and everyone, I made it to Hogwarts safely, and it's everything you said it would be and more. The castle is magnificent, the Great Hall is beyond description, and I've already made some promising friendships with my fellow Gryffindors. More importantly, I felt confident and prepared throughout the entire evening. All the reading, studying, and preparation you arranged for me paid off completely. Instead of being overwhelmed by unfamiliarity, I was able to appreciate the magic of it all. Professor McGonagall gave me a particularly warm welcome, and even Professor Snape seemed, well, perhaps not pleased, but certainly surprised by how well prepared I am. I know you worried about how I would handle the attention and expectations, but honestly, it felt manageable. 2 years of your care and guidance have given me the confidence to be myself rather than trying to be whatever other people expect Harry Potter to be. Thank you for everything, for rescuing me, for healing me, for preparing me, and for giving me a family that makes me strong enough to face whatever comes next. Classes start tomorrow, and I'm genuinely excited to begin learning magic properly. I'll write again soon with news of my progress. All my love, Harry P.S. And Neville is settling in beautifully as well. You should be very proud of both your boys." As he sealed the letter and prepared it for morning owl post, Harry reflected on how dramatically different this Hogwarts arrival had been from what it might have been. He was here not as a damaged boy desperate for acceptance, but as a young wizard confident in his place in the world and excited to learn everything this magnificent school could teach him. Tomorrow would bring his first real magic lessons, his first opportunity to prove that 2 years of preparation and healing had given him not just knowledge, but the confidence to excel. For the first time since arriving at Hogwarts, Harry Potter fell asleep, not as the famous boy who lived, but simply as Harry, a well-loved child ready to become the wizard he was meant to be. Or Chapter 11, Standing Strong. The first confrontation with Professor Snape came during Harry's second potions lesson, when the potions master decided to test whether the famous Harry Potter would crumble under his particular brand of intimidation. "Potter," Snape said, his voice cutting across the dungeon like a blade as he materialized beside Harry's cauldron. "Tell me, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" Harry looked up from his perfectly prepared ingredients. 2 years of Augusta's insistence on precise organization had served him well, and met Snape's dark eyes with calm confidence rather than the terror the professor clearly expected. "The draught of living death, sir," Harry replied evenly, "was a powerful sleeping potion created by combining the powdered asphodel root with wormwood infusion in a 2-to-1 ratio, simmered counterclockwise for 13 minutes, then left to steep for exactly 7 hours. Snape's expression flickered with surprise at the thoroughness of the answer, but he pressed on. "And where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar? In the stomach of a goat, sir. Bezoars are formed from calcified matter and serve as universal antidotes to most poisons. However, they're not effective against all toxins. Basilisk venom, for instance, requires phoenix tears for neutralization." The dungeon had gone completely silent. Even Snape seemed momentarily at a loss for words, clearly having expected the stammering ignorance that would have given him excuse for his characteristic cruelty. "What is the difference?" Snape said finally, his voice tight with frustration, "between monkshood and wolfsbane?" "There is no difference, sir," Harry said with the same calm confidence. "Monkshood and wolfsbane are common names for aconite, which is highly toxic in its raw form, but essential in the brewing of several advanced potions, including the wolfsbane potion, that allows werewolves to maintain their human consciousness during transformation." Snape stared at him for a long moment, clearly thrown off balance by Harry's comprehensive knowledge and complete lack of intimidation. Finally, he stepped back with visible frustration. 5 points from Gryffindor," he said harshly, "for showing off." The declaration was so transparently unfair that several students gasped, but Harry's response was not the hurt confusion it might have been. Instead, he looked directly at Snape with the kind of respectful but firm challenge that Augusta had taught him to use when faced with unreasonable authority. "Professor," Harry said, quietly but clearly, "I answered your questions accurately and completely, as requested. If my knowledge level exceeds your expectations, perhaps that reflects the quality of education I received, rather than any desire to show off." The silence that followed was absolute. No first-year student had ever spoken to Severus Snape with such composed dignity, and certainly no Potter had ever looked at him without fear or hatred. Snape's face went through several interesting color changes before settling on an expression of barely controlled fury. "Detention, Potter. Tonight. Very well. Oh, sir," Harry said calmly, "should I bring writing materials? Or will this be a practical detention?" Even Hermione, watching from her station beside him, looked awed by Harry's complete refusal to be cowed. This was not the desperate people-pleasing she might have expected from an abused child, nor was it the reckless defiance that might have come from a boy with nothing left to lose. This was the quiet confidence of someone who knew his own worth and refused to accept treatment that diminished it. The detention that evening proved to be an exercise in futility for Snape. Harry arrived punctually, completed his assigned tasks with meticulous efficiency, and responded to every sneer and cutting remark with polite professionalism. When Snape finally dismissed him an hour later, it was clear that the professor had gained nothing from the encounter except frustration at his inability to break Harry's composure. "How do you do it?" Ron asked later that evening, as they sat by the fire in the Gryffindor common room. "Snape's been picking on students for years, but you just didn't let him." "Augusta taught me that bullies rely on fear to maintain their power," Harry said simply. "If you don't give them fear, they don't have anything to work with." "But weren't you scared?" Hermione asked, looking at Harry with something approaching admiration. "I would have been terrified." "Of course I was nervous," Harry admitted. "But being nervous doesn't mean I have to let someone treat me unfairly. Professor Snape is a teacher, which means he has authority over my education. And that doesn't mean he has the right to humiliate me for answering questions correctly." It was this same confidence and clarity of thought that served Harry well when strange things began happening at Hogwarts. The break-in at Gringotts, the mysterious third-floor corridor, the nervous behavior of several teachers, all of it pointed to something significant occurring at the school. Unlike his canonical self, however, Harry didn't shoulder the investigation alone out of desperate heroism. Instead, he approached it with the methodical thinking Augusta had taught him, and the understanding that trustworthy adults were resources to be utilized, not obstacles to be circumvented. "Something's definitely going on," Harry said to Ron and Hermione as they sat in the library, researching the mysterious Nicholas Flamel that had been mentioned in connection with the Gringotts break-in. "But I think we should be smart about how we investigate." "What do you mean?" Hermione asked. "I mean, we gather information carefully. We don't take unnecessary risks, and when we have something concrete to report, we report it to people who can actually do something about it." Ron looked confused. "Like who?" "Like Kingsley," Harry said matter-of-factly. "He's a senior Auror. He's been like a mentor to me since my rescue. And if there's really something dangerous happening at Hogwarts, he needs to know about it." The letter Harry sent to Kingsley that evening was a masterpiece of careful observation and logical deduction. "Dear Kingsley, I hope you're well. I wanted to bring something to your attention that might be relevant to your work. There have been several unusual incidents at Hogwarts this term that, individually, might be unremarkable, but together suggest something significant might be occurring. 1. A break-in at Gringotts on the day I collected my school supplies, with reports that the vault targeted had been emptied earlier that same day. 2. A third-floor corridor that has been declared off-limits to students, guarded by something that sounds very large and potentially dangerous. 3. Several professors displaying signs of nervousness and increased security awareness. 4. But mentions of someone named Nicholas Flamel in connection with whatever was removed from Gringotts. I'm not suggesting anything improper is happening, but my friends and I have been researching these connections, and it seems possible that something valuable or dangerous might be hidden at Hogwarts. Given your expertise and the fact that the safety of students might be involved, I thought you should be aware. I hope this isn't just first-year imagination running wild, but Augusta always said it's better to report concerns to competent adults than to assume someone else will handle things. Please let me know if you need any additional information. Yours truly, Harry. Kingsley's response came by return owl, and was everything Harry could have hoped for. Harry, your observations are excellent, and your instinct to report them was exactly right. You've identified connections that we've been investigating from the Ministry side for some time. I can't share operational details, but I can tell you that your safety and that of your fellow students is being carefully monitored. Continue to be observant, but please don't take any risks or attempt to investigate these matters directly. If you notice anything else unusual, report it immediately to Professor McGonagall, or send word to me. You've done exactly what a responsible young wizard should do when faced with potentially dangerous situations. Augusta would be very proud. Stay safe, Kingsley. Armed with this validation and guidance, Harry found himself taking a leadership role among his friends that was born of confidence rather than desperate heroism. When they discovered that the three-headed dog was guarding something related to Nicholas Flamel and the Philosopher's Stone, Harry's response was to gather more information and maintain their connection with responsible adults rather than charging forward alone. "We need to figure out who's trying to steal the stone," Harry said during one of their library sessions. "But we also need to be smart about it. If we can identify the threat, we can make sure the right people know about it." "You really think we should tell the teachers?" Ron asked dubiously. "I think we should tell the right teachers," Harry corrected. "Professor McGonagall has been a friend to me since before I started Hogwarts. If we bring her solid information, she'll listen." It was this approach that led to Harry's first direct confrontation with Dumbledore since the Wizengamot hearing. When McGonagall arranged for Harry to meet with the headmaster to discuss his concerns about school security, Harry entered the office with the same calm confidence he had shown with Snape. "Ah, Harry," Dumbledore said, his eyes twinkling with what might have been nostalgia. "Professor McGonagall tells me you have some concerns about safety at Hogwarts." "I do, Professor," Harry said, taking the offered seat with the poise of someone who had learned to navigate formal conversations with adults. "I believe someone is attempting to steal the Philosopher's Stone that's being protected here, and I'm concerned about the safety of students if that attempt escalates." Dumbledore's expression grew more serious. "Those are grave concerns indeed. What makes you believe students might be in danger?" "Because," Harry said with the kind of directness Augusta had taught him to use when discussing serious matters, "it appears that the stone's protection relies partly on challenges that students could theoretically navigate. If the thief realizes this, they might attempt to use students as unwilling assistants, or students might stumble into the situation accidentally." The headmaster was quiet for a long moment, studying Harry with an expression that held traces of both admiration and something that might have been regret. "You have grown into quite a remarkable young man, Harry," Dumbledore said finally. "Very different from what might have been expected." "With respect, Professor," Harry said, meeting the headmaster's gaze steadily. "I think I've grown into exactly the person I was meant to be, given proper care and guidance. The question now is whether the school's administration is going to take appropriate action to ensure student safety, or whether students are going to be left to handle dangerous situations on their own." It was a challenge, politely phrased but unmistakable in its implications. Harry Potter, 11 years old, but backed by 2 years of healing and proper support, was holding the most powerful wizard in Britain accountable for the safety of Hogwarts students. Dumbledore's response was telling. "I assure you, Harry, that every possible precaution is being taken. The stone is perfectly safe, and students who follow school rules will not encounter any danger." "And if someone doesn't follow school rules?" Harry asked pointedly. "If a first-year student stumbles into the third-floor corridor by accident, or if someone attempting to steal the stone decides to use students as shields or tools?" "Then," Dumbledore said, with what might have been the first fully honest answer he had given, "I hope that student would have the wisdom to seek help from trusted adults, rather than attempting to handle the situation alone." Harry nodded, recognizing both the implicit admission that danger existed and the instruction about proper protocol. "I understand, Professor, and I hope that the trusted adults would be prepared to provide that help quickly and effectively." As Harry left the headmaster's office, he felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with defeating enemies or solving mysteries single-handedly. This was the satisfaction of a young person who had successfully advocated for safety and accountability through proper channels, backed by confidence in his own worth and the support of adults who genuinely cared about his well-being. That evening he wrote to Augusta. "Dear Augusta, I wanted to update you on the situation I mentioned in my last letter. I've spoken with both Kingsley and Professor Dumbledore about the security concerns, and I believe appropriate action is being taken. More importantly, I've realized something about the difference between courage and recklessness. Courage, I think, means standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Recklessness means taking unnecessary risks because you don't believe help is available. Thanks to you, Neville, Kingsley, and everyone else who has supported me, I know help is always available. That knowledge doesn't make me less brave. It makes me smarter about how I use my bravery. I hope that makes sense. I'm still learning how to be the person you've helped me become, but I think I'm starting to understand what that means. All my love, Harry." As he sealed the letter, Harry reflected on how fundamentally different his first year at Hogwarts was from what it might have been. Instead of stumbling through crises alone, driven by desperate heroism and a need to prove his worth, he was navigating challenges with confidence, support, and the understanding that his value as a person didn't depend on being a hero. He was simply Harry Potter, a young wizard with good friends, trusted adults, and the confidence to stand up for what was right without needing to carry the world on his shoulders. And that, he was beginning to understand, was exactly who he was meant to be. Chapter 12. A New Future. The Philosopher's Stone crisis ended not with a desperate first year's solitary heroics, but with a coordinated response from Hogwarts. Security, ministry auras, and one very well-prepared 11-year-old who understood the value of proper communication. When Professor Quirrell finally made his move to steal the stone, he found himself facing not a traumatized child he could easily manipulate, but a network of protections that had been carefully orchestrated thanks to Harry's earlier reports. So Kingsley arrived with a team of auras, just as Quirrell reached the Mirror of Erised, and the possessed professor's capture was swift and efficient. Harry watched from a safe distance as Kingsley placed the anti-possession restraints on Quirrell, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and relief that had nothing to do with personal glory. This was what proper investigation and adult cooperation could accomplish. Justice without unnecessary risk to children. "Well done, Harry," Kingsley said afterward, as they stood in McGonagall's office reviewing the incident. "Your observations and reports gave us exactly what we needed to prevent a genuine catastrophe." "I'm just glad no students were hurt," Harry replied, and meant it completely. The idea of facing down a possessed teacher alone, or of shouldering that kind of responsibility at 11 years old, seemed both impossible and unnecessary, given the support system he had learned to rely on. Professor McGonagall looked at him with the kind of pride that had become familiar over the course of his first year. "Mr. Potter, your maturity and judgment throughout this situation have been exemplary. You've demonstrated exactly the kind of responsible citizenship we hope to instill in our students." The end-of-year feast was a celebration not just of Gryffindor's House Cup victory, earned through consistent excellence rather than dramatic last-minute heroics, but of Harry's first successful year as the person he had become rather than the symbol others expected him to be. "Oh, I can't believe you got perfect marks in defense against the dark arts," Hermione said, as they reviewed their end-of-year results. "Professor Quirrell barely taught us anything before everything happened." "Augusta made sure I had tutoring in basic defense theory," Harry explained. "She said it was too important to leave to chance." "Your grandmother thinks of everything," Ron said, with obvious admiration. "My mum's brilliant, but she's never planned anything 2 years in advance." Harry smiled at the automatic way Ron referred to Augusta as his grandmother. Over the course of the year, his friends had come to understand that the Longbottom family wasn't just his guardians. They were his family, chosen and real and permanent in ways that had nothing to do with blood or legal obligations. The train ride back to London was filled with excited planning for the summer. Ron had invited Harry to visit the Burrow, Hermione wanted to exchange letters about books they'd discovered, and Neville was already planning the magical projects they could work on together at Longbottom Hall. "It's going to be the best summer ever," Harry said, and the certainty in his voice was born of experience rather than hope. He had learned what good summers looked like, what it meant to have a home to return to where he was wanted and valued. Augusta met them at King's Cross with the kind of fierce pride that had become Harry's birthright over the past 3 years. She embraced both boys with equal enthusiasm, listened to their excited recounting of the year's events, and made it clear that their safety and happiness were her primary concerns. "Oh, I'm so proud of you both," she said, as they settled into the car for the drive home. "Your letters told me you were doing well, but seeing you now, confident, happy, surrounded by friends, it's everything I hoped for when you first came to us, Harry." That evening, as the family, for that's what they were, Harry reflected, a family in every way that mattered, sat in the garden at Longbottom Hall sharing dinner and stories, Harry found himself thinking about the path that had led him here. 3 years ago, he had been a terrified 8-year-old living in a cupboard, convinced that he was a burden and a freak, with no understanding of his own worth or potential. Now he was an 11-year-old with perfect marks, genuine friendships, and a clear sense of who he was and who he wanted to become. "What are you thinking about?" "Dear," Augusta asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. "Just how different everything is," Harry said. "How different I am. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Kingsley hadn't found me that day." Augusta's expression grew serious. "I try not to think about that too often," she said quietly. "But I know this. You would have survived, because that's who you are. You have a strength that goes deeper than circumstances. It might have taken longer, the path might have been harder, but you would have found your way to being exactly who you were meant to be." "Maybe," Harry said, "but I'm grateful I didn't have to do it alone." Neville, who had been listening to this exchange with the serious attention he gave to all discussions of family and belonging, spoke up. "You'll never have to do anything alone again. We're family." "Yes," Augusta said firmly. "We are, and nothing will ever change that." The summer passed with the kind of wonderful normalcy that Harry had never experienced before his rescue. Days filled with magical experiments under Augusta's careful supervision, visits from friends, trips to magical sites for educational and enjoyable purposes, and the slow, steady work of growing up surrounded by love and support. Kingsley visited regularly, their relationship evolving from rescuer and victim to mentor and protégé. Over long conversations in Augusta's garden, Harry began to solidify his understanding of what he wanted to do with his life. "I want to be an aura," Harry said during one of these talks. "Not because I want to be famous or because I think I have some destiny to fulfill, but because I want to help people the way you helped me." Kingsley studied him carefully. "Being an aura isn't about heroics, Harry. It's about careful investigation, adherence to law, and putting yourself between innocent people and those who would harm them. It can be dangerous work, and it requires absolute integrity." "I know," Harry said. "That's exactly why I want to do it. I want to make sure other children don't have to go through what I went through. I want to help people who can't help themselves." "Those are good reasons," Kingsley said with approval. "And with proper training and education, I think you'd make an excellent aura. But remember, you have time to grow and learn and change your mind. Don't lock yourself into any path just because it seems right at 11. "I won't," Harry promised. "But I also won't forget why I want to help people." The letter exchanges with his Hogwarts friends throughout the summer were revelatory in their ordinariness. These were normal childhood friendships, arguments about Quidditch teams, shared excitement about new books, complaints about boring family visits, and eager planning for the coming school year. For the first time in his life, Harry was experiencing the simple joy of being liked for himself rather than for his fame or his story. "Dear Harry," Hermione wrote in one typical letter, "I've been reading about advanced transfiguration theory, and I think we could get a head start on second-year material if we study together when we get back to school. Also, my parents took me to France this summer, and the magical quarter in Paris is amazing. You and Neville would love the botanical gardens. How are your magical experiments going?" "Dear Harry," Ron wrote in his characteristically casual style, "Mum's been driving us all mad with her cleaning, but she's also been teaching me some brilliant hexes that Fred and George don't know yet. Can't wait to try them out at school. Dad says he might be able to get tickets to the Quidditch World Cup next summer. Think Augusta would let you come with us?" These were the concerns and excitements of normal children living normal magical lives, and Harry treasured every ordinary word. As the summer drew to a close and preparations began for his second year at Hogwarts, Harry found himself reflecting on how fundamentally his relationship with the future had changed. Instead of simply hoping to survive from one day to the next, that he was actively planning for a life full of possibilities. "I have goals now," he told Augusta as they shopped for his second-year supplies in Diagon Alley. "Real goals, not just survival goals. And what are those goals? Augusta asked with interest. I want to excel in my studies. I want to be a good friend to Ron and Hermione and all the people who care about me. I want to learn everything I can about magic and law and how to help people. And someday, I want to be an Auror who makes sure children are safe. Augusta smiled with the fierce pride that had become one of Harry's most treasured constants. Those are wonderful goals, Harry, and I have absolutely no doubt that you'll achieve every one of them. The night before his departure for his second year, Harry sat in his room at Longbottom Hall. His room, in his home, was with his family, and wrote in the journal Kingsley had given him 2 years earlier. Tomorrow I go back to Hogwarts for my second year. I'm excited in a way that has nothing to do with escaping from something, and everything to do with moving toward something. 3 years ago, Kingsley saved my life by finding me in that cupboard. But it wasn't just about getting me away from the Dursleys. It was about giving me the chance to discover who I really am when I'm surrounded by love and support instead of fear and neglect. I'm Harry Potter, but that's not the most important thing about me anymore. I'm Augusta and Neville's family member. I'm Ron and Hermione's friend. I'm a student who loves learning. I'm someone who wants to help other people. I don't know exactly what the future holds, but I know it's going to be good. Well, not because everything will be easy, but because I have people who love me, and I have goals that matter to me. That's more than enough to build a life on. When I'm an Auror someday, I want to remember this feeling, the feeling of being safe and loved and full of possibilities. I want to help other children find that feeling too. 15 years later. Senior Auror Harry Potter stood in the doorway of a small bedroom, watching as his partner, Auror Kingsley Shacklebolt, now head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, gently interviewed a 7-year-old magical child who had been found living in conditions that made Harry's stomach clench with familiar anger. "It's all right," Kingsley was saying to the frightened girl. "You're safe now, and no one is going to hurt you anymore." The child's eyes were wide with the kind of terror Harry remembered all too well, but there was something else there too, a tiny spark of hope that someone had finally come to help. "What happens now?" the little girl whispered. "Now," Harry said, stepping into the room with the gentle confidence that had made him one of the Ministry's most effective investigators of child endangerment cases. "We make sure you go somewhere where people will take proper care of you, where you'll have your own room and plenty to eat, and adults who think you're wonderful just as you are." "Really?" the girl asked, and the desperate hope in her voice was almost too much for Harry to bear. "Really," Harry promised, thinking of Augusta Longbottom's fierce protectiveness, of Neville's steadfast friendship, or of the family that had chosen him and made him whole. "There are people in the world whose job it is to love children and keep them safe. We're going to find you some of those people." As they walked the child out of the house, where she had been hidden and hurt, Harry caught Kingsley's eye. His mentor smiled with the same pride he had shown when Harry was 11 years old, and learning to stand up for himself and others. "Good work," Kingsley said quietly. "Another child saved." "Another child who gets the chance to discover who they really are," Harry corrected, watching as the little girl was gently transferred to the care of a Ministry family placement specialist who would help her find a real home. Harry Potter had found his purpose in life, and it was exactly what he had dreamed of as an 11-year-old sitting in the garden at Longbottom Hall, making sure that no child had to face the darkness alone, and that every child had the chance to discover the light of being truly loved. The boy who had once lived in a cupboard under the stairs now spent his days opening doors. Doors to safety, to hope, to futures bright with possibility. And he had never been happier to be exactly who he was meant to be.